I have 30 days to live, he whispered, so close that his breath smelled faintly of expensive whiskey and regret. His hands trembled as he reached for mine across the marble table where crystal glasses caught the amber light of Manhattan's most exclusive bistro. I looked at him, this man who had humiliated me just hours before, and said something no millionaire ever expects from a waitress. Maybe you're serving tables for people who don't appreciate it, or cleaning up after everyone else has left. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 58 years old, and I've been carrying trays and swallowing pride for more years than I care to count. This morning, like every morning for the past 12 years, I woke up at 4:30 in my cramped studio apartment in Queens. The radiator clangs like an old ghost, and the sirens from the street below remind me that New York never sleeps. But sometimes, neither do I. The mirror in my bathroom shows a woman I barely recognize anymore. Gray roots peek through the auburn dye I can barely afford to touch up every 2 months. My hands are rough from years of hot water and bleach, and there are permanent grooves in my shoulders from carrying heavy trays. But my eyes still hold something that 20 years of restaurant work couldn't break. Call it pride. Call it stubbornness. I call it survival. The subway ride from Queens to Manhattan takes 45 minutes on a good day. I squeeze between construction workers heading to early shifts and office cleaners finishing their night rounds. The car smells like coffee and exhaustion, and I press my face against the window to watch the city wake up. Skyscrapers stretch toward heaven, each one housing fortunes I'll never touch, dreams I'll never reach. Le Bernardin's little sister, that's what we call Chez Laurent, the upscale French bistro where I've worked for over a decade. It sits on the corner of 5th Avenue and 58th Street, close enough to Central Park that the wealthy can walk off their guilt after dropping $300 on dinner. The brass nameplate gleams in the morning sun, and tourists stop to take photos of the elegant facade. They never notice the service entrance where I slip in every morning at 6 sharp. The kitchen is already alive when I arrive. Steam rises from prep stations, where line cooks chop shallots and reduce wine sauces. The air is thick with garlic, thyme, and the bitter edge of espresso from the machine that never stops brewing. Chef Laurent. Not his real name, but the one he adopted when he discovered French cuisine sold better than his Wisconsin roots, barks orders in accented English that fools exactly no one who's actually been to Paris. My uniform hangs in a locker that smells like industrial detergent and decade-old cigarettes. Black pants, crisp white shirt, black apron that reaches my knees. The fabric is synthetic, chosen for its ability to hide stains and survive countless washing machine cycles. I pin my hair back with bobby pins bought in bulk from the dollar store, and I check my reflection one last time. Smile, Maggie. Smile like your rent depends on it. Because it does. The dining room at Chez Laurent is a temple to excess. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in starch linen. Each place setting includes more silverware than most people own in their entire kitchen. The walls are painted a soft cream that probably has a French name and costs more per gallon than I make in a day. Oil paintings of pastoral scenes hang in gilded frames, depicting a countryside that exists only in the imaginations of people who've never actually worked a field. My section includes 6 tables. Table 12 by the window, where divorced hedge fund managers bring their much younger girlfriends. Table 15 in the corner, favored by pharmaceutical executives who discuss million-dollar drug patents between courses. Table 18 near the bar, where tech entrepreneurs nurse $20 cocktails and plan their next cryptocurrency investment. Each table represents a world I can observe but never enter, like watching a movie through bulletproof glass. The regulars know me by name, or at least they pretend to. Mrs. Patterson, who comes every Tuesday for the sole millionaire and always asks about my daughter, the one I never had. Mr. Chen from the law firm upstairs, who tips 20% and never complains when the kitchen runs slow. Dr. Rodriguez, who orders the same Chablis every Friday and once asked if I had health insurance. I told him yes, though the policy covers so little, I might as well be praying to St. Jude for healing. But most customers see right through me. I'm part of the ambiance, like the soft jazz playing overhead or the fresh orchids on each table. They wave their hands without looking up from their phones when they want another glass of wine. They interrupt my explanation of the specials to take business calls about stock portfolios and real estate acquisitions. They discuss their children's private school tuition and their summer homes in the Hamptons, while I refill their water glasses with invisible precision. The money these people spend on a single dinner could cover my rent for a month. They order bottles of wine worth more than my monthly Metro card, then leave half of it unfinished. They talk about their investment portfolios the way other people discuss the weather, casually mentioning Bitcoin purchases and dividend yields that represent more wealth than I'll see in a lifetime. Their watch collections, their art acquisitions, their private jet shares, it's all mentioned as naturally as breathing. And yet, they look surprised when the check arrives, as if they've forgotten that someone has to pay for this privilege. They hand over Black American Express cards without checking the total, their net worth so vast that a $300 dinner is mathematically insignificant. Some leave generous tips, 20–25%, and I accept their charity with a grateful smile. Others calculate exactly 15%, as if my service was a business transaction rather than 8 hours of standing on my feet, memorizing their preferences, and pretending their casual rudeness doesn't sting. My feet ache by noon. My lower back sends shooting pains up my spine when I bend to clear low tables. My smile becomes more automatic as the day wears on, a muscle memory that doesn't require conscious thought. The lunch crowd gives way to the dinner crowd, which brings its own particular breed of entitled cruelty. Investment bankers celebrating another record quarter, pharmaceutical executives toasting FDA approvals that will make them millionaires, real estate developers planning luxury condominiums that will displace working families like mine. I learned to read the signs. The way someone snaps their fingers instead of making eye contact means trouble. The impatient sigh when I explain that the kitchen is running 20 minutes behind on the duck confit. The eye roll when I ask if they have any food allergies, as if caring about their well-being is somehow presumptuous. I've developed a sixth sense for the customers who will find fault with everything, the ones who will send back a perfectly prepared steak because asserting dominance over the help makes them feel powerful. The worst part isn't the rudeness, it's the invisibility. Conversations pause when I approach a table, not out of politeness, but because I'm not fully human to them. I'm a service, like the heat in winter or the lights that come on when they flip a switch. They discuss intimate details of their lives, affairs, bankruptcies, family scandals, as if I'm not standing 3 feet away with their wine glasses. They make racist jokes and crude comments about women, pausing only to order another round of drinks before continuing their verbal assault on human dignity. Sometimes I want to interrupt. When the pharmaceutical executive brags about price gouging insulin patients, I want to tell him about my neighbor who rations her doses because she can't afford proper treatment. When the hedge fund manager complains about his daughter's expensive wedding, while simultaneously describing his plan to short sell a community hospital stock, I want to ask him how he sleeps at night. When the tech entrepreneur discusses his plan to replace service workers with artificial intelligence, I want to remind him that each job lost represents a human being trying to survive. But I say nothing, because I need this job. Because speaking out would mean finding myself on the sidewalk with no reference and no prospects. Because I've seen what happens to servers who forget their place in this carefully choreographed dance of wealth and service. So I smile, and I nod, and I pretend their casual cruelty doesn't chip away at my soul one interaction at a time. The end of each shift brings temporary relief. I count my tips in the break room, separated from the dining room by a door that might as well be a portal between worlds. Good nights yield enough to cover groceries and a small payment toward my credit card debt. Bad nights leave me calculating whether I can afford both MetroCard and dinner, knowing that one will have to wait until tomorrow. My bank account balance hovers permanently in the low hundreds, each unexpected expense, a broken tooth, a torn uniform, a subway fare increase, threatening to push me underwater. My apartment in Queens is a 30-minute subway ride from the Golden Palace where I spend my days. It's a studio in a building that was probably elegant in 1962 but now slouches toward decay with the resignation of a tired old woman. The hallways smell like cooking oil and disappointment. The elevator works sporadically, which means I often climb 5 flights of stairs after 10 hours on my feet. But it's mine. This small space with its single window facing another building exactly like it. I heat up a can of soup for dinner and sit at the small table that serves as both dining room and office. Bills spread across its surface like tarot cards predicting a bleak future. Rent, utilities, phone, groceries, MetroCard, health insurance premiums that cover almost nothing. The numbers never quite add up, no matter how carefully I calculate. There's always more month left at the end of the money. My television is old enough to require a digital converter, but it provides company in the evenings. I watch cooking shows and imagine having a kitchen big enough for more than a hot plate and a mini refrigerator. I watch travel documentaries about places I'll never visit, mountain villages and seaside towns where people seem to move more slowly, smile more genuinely. I watch the news and see stories about economic recovery and rising stock markets, and I wonder if that prosperity will ever trickle down to the 5 flights of stairs where I count pennies. Sleep comes hard after days filled with forced smiles and swallowed pride. I lie awake calculating tip percentages and planning tomorrow's tasks. Sometimes I dream about the restaurant, finding myself trapped in an endless shift where the tables multiply and the customers become increasingly demanding. I wake up tired, already rehearsing the cheerful greeting I'll use on the first customer of the day. The loneliness is the hardest part. I'm surrounded by people all day, but the interactions are scripted, transactional. Good evening, my name is Maggie and I'll be your server tonight. Can I start you with something to drink? How would you like that cooked? The words flow automatically, but they don't constitute real conversation. Real connection requires seeing someone as fully human, and in the ecosystem of fine dining, servers exist in the background like wallpaper with legs. I've been single for 8 years now since David decided that a woman who smells like kitchen grease and comes home exhausted every night wasn't worth the effort. He found someone younger, someone who didn't have to work weekends and could afford to split the check at trendy restaurants. I understood his decision even as it broke my heart. Who wants to date someone who can't afford to join you for the lifestyle you're building? Who wants to love someone whose schedule revolves around other people's dinner plans? Family gatherings are exercises in well-meaning humiliation. My sister Nancy married a dentist and lives in Westchester with her 2 teenage children and their golden retriever. Their house has a 2-car garage and a kitchen island bigger than my entire apartment. Nancy means well when she asks about my career plans and suggests I might consider transitioning into something more suitable for someone my age. She doesn't understand that transition requires capital I don't possess, credentials I can't afford to earn, and a financial cushion that would allow me to work unpaid internships or take lower-paying entry-level positions. My brother Mike drives a truck for UPS and constantly reminds me that I could make more money in logistics. He's not wrong, but he's also not offering to cover my expenses while I train for commercial driving licenses or pivot to an entirely new industry. His wife Linda performs that particular kind of family cruelty disguised as concern, suggesting that maybe I should have planned better for this stage of my life, as if working full-time and barely making ends meet was a character flaw rather than an economic reality. The holidays are particularly brutal. Christmas dinners at Nancy's house, surrounded by people discussing their investment portfolios and retirement planning, their children's college funds, and spring break destinations. They talk about their Bitcoin investments and diversified stock portfolios, while I sit quietly, calculating whether I can afford to bring a nicer bottle of wine next year. They mean well when they offer to help me get back on my feet, but their solutions require resources I don't have or connections that exist outside my world. I've learned to deflect their concern with humor and change the subject quickly. Yes, I'm still at the restaurant. No, I'm not looking for other work right now. The benefits are good, a lie that protects my pride and their comfort. The people are nice. Another lie that prevents conversations about the daily indignities I endure. I'm happy. The biggest lie of all, but one that allows family dinners to proceed without anyone having to confront the reality of economic inequality that exists even within our own bloodline. The truth is that I'm trapped in a job that pays too little to save money but too much to risk losing. I'm too old to start over in a new career but too young to retire with dignity. I'm too proud to ask for help, but too exhausted to refuse it when it's offered in forms that feel like charity rather than support. I exist in the liminal space of working poverty, where I'm employed but not secure, productive but not valued, essential but not appreciated. Some nights I stand at my single window and look out at the city lights. Each illuminated window represents someone living their life, making their choices, pursuing their dreams, or settling into their compromises. I wonder about their stories, their struggles, their private victories and defeats. I wonder if anyone in those glowing apartments ever thinks about the woman who served their dinner, who smiled while they were rude, who listened to their casual cruelty and pretended it didn't matter. And then I remember that tomorrow is another day, another chance to earn enough money to pay another day's worth of bills. I set my alarm for 4:30 and lay out my uniform for morning. I moisturize my hands with the cheap lotion that barely softens the calluses from carrying trays. I check my phone one last time, hoping for a message from someone who sees me as more than a function, someone who values my thoughts rather than my service. The message never comes, but morning always does, and with it another day of invisible labor in service of people who will never know my name, never consider my circumstances, never recognize the dignity I maintain despite their determined attempts to strip it away. I am more than they see, worth more than they'll ever know, carrying stories and dreams and wisdom that their wealth will never purchase. But they don't know that yet. They won't until the day everything changes. That day started like any other. February rain drummed against the windows of Chez Laurent, turning Fifth Avenue into a river of expensive umbrellas and hurried footsteps. The lunch crowd had been particularly demanding, pharmaceutical executives celebrating FDA approval for a new arthritis drug that would retail for $3,000 per month. They'd ordered the most expensive items on the menu and discussed their projected profits between courses, calculating dividend yields and bonus distributions while I refilled their water glasses. "Maggie, table 7 needs attention," called James, our sommelier, as he polished the crystal wine glasses that caught the gray afternoon light. Table 7 was in my section, positioned near the window with a view of Central Park's winter bare trees. I approached with my practiced smile, notepad ready, prepared for another round of corporate celebration where I'd serve as an invisible facilitator of someone else's financial success. That's when I saw him for the first time. He sat alone at the 4-person table, his presence somehow managing to diminish the elegant dining room. Everything about him screamed wealth, but not the comfortable inherited wealth of old New York families. This was aggressive, acquisitive wealth, the kind earned through conquest rather than cultivation. His watch was a Patek Philippe that cost more than I'd make in 5 years. His suit was clearly bespoke, tailored to accommodate shoulders that had never lifted anything heavier than a brandy snifter. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to mirror brightness, but it was his eyes that made my skin crawl, cold, calculating, predatory. He looked at me the way a hawk studies a mouse, not with hatred, but with the casual indifference of absolute superiority. When he spoke, His voice carried the particular brand of entitlement that comes from never having to consider consequences for your actions. "Finally," he said without looking up from his phone, where cryptocurrency prices scrolled across the screen in green and red columns. "I've been waiting 5 whole minutes. Don't you people understand that time is money?" I maintained my professional composure, though something about his tone made my jaw clench. "I apologize for the wait, sir. My name is Maggie, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. Can I start you with something to drink?" He glanced up then, and his cold appraisal felt like being evaluated for auction. "Maggie," he repeated, as if testing how my name felt in his mouth. "That's a servant's name if I ever heard one. Perfect casting." He returned to his phone without waiting for a response, scrolling through what appeared to be stock prices and international currency exchange rates. "Bring me your most expensive scotch, the 18-year-old Macallan, if you actually have anything decent in this tourist trap." The casual cruelty in his voice was nothing new. I'd served plenty of arrogant customers over the years. But something about his delivery, the particular pleasure he seemed to take in, diminishing me, sparked a familiar anger in my chest. I swallowed it as I always did, and maintained my professional demeanor. "Certainly, sir. The Macallan 18 is $250 for a 3-ounce pour. Would you like that neat, or—" "Did I ask for a price quote?" he interrupted, still not looking up from his screen. "Just bring it. And while you're at it, tell me about your specials. But speak quickly. I have a conference call with Hong Kong in 20 minutes about a merger that's worth more money than you'll see in your entire sad little lifetime." I began reciting the evening's specials, describing the preparation methods and ingredients with the practiced precision that Chef Laurent demanded. But I could see he wasn't listening. He was scrolling through what appeared to be cryptocurrency portfolios, occasionally making small sounds of satisfaction when certain digital assets showed gains. Millions of dollars moving with the casual swipe of his manicured finger. "The duck confit is prepared with—" I continued. "Stop," he said, holding up one hand while typing with the other. "Just being me the most expensive thing you have. I don't care what it is. I'm meeting someone later who needs to understand exactly what kind of money we're dealing with." He looked up then, and his smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "You understand the concept of impressing people, don't you, Maggie? Or do you only understand taking orders and hoping for tips?" The insult was delivered with such casual precision that several nearby tables glanced over. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I maintained my composure. This was far from the first time a customer had tried to humiliate me for their own entertainment. Wealthy men, in particular, seemed to enjoy demonstrating their power over service workers, as if my professional courtesy was an invitation for abuse. "I'll bring you the Wagyu beef," I said evenly. "It's $450 and serves 2, but I can have the kitchen prepare a single portion if you prefer." "$450? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's adorable. I made more than that while we've been talking." He gestured to his phone, where I could see multiple trading apps running simultaneously. Bitcoin just jumped 3%, which means I made about $12,000 during this fascinating conversation. But sure, bring me the overpriced cow, and make sure it's cooked properly. I'm assuming competence is within your skill set, despite all evidence to the contrary. I returned to the kitchen with his order, my hands shaking slightly as I relayed the details to Chef Laurent. The kitchen staff could see my agitation. We'd all developed a sixth sense for customers who crossed the line from demanding into actively cruel. Maria, who worked prep, squeezed my shoulder sympathetically. Carlos, one of the line cooks, muttered something about rich customers in Spanish that I didn't need translated to understand. "Table 7? Asked James, the sommelier, reading my expression with practiced ease. "Cryptocurrency millionaire," I said, which was sufficient explanation. We'd served plenty of newly wealthy tech entrepreneurs and Bitcoin investors over the years. Old money at least had the decency to be politely condescending. New money, especially digital money, often came with the particular cruelty of people who believed their wealth was pure meritocracy, rather than a combination of luck, timing, and ruthless opportunism. I returned to his table with the scotch, served in a crystal glass that caught the light like liquid amber. He accepted it without acknowledgement, as if the expensive liquor had materialized through divine intervention rather than my labor. He took a sip, made a small sound of approval, and returned to his phone screen where financial charts painted the future in green and red pixels. "Tell me something, Maggie," he said after several minutes of silence, his voice carrying the lazy certainty of a cat playing with prey. "How long have you been doing this particular job?" The question felt like a trap, but I answered honestly. 12 years at this restaurant, sir. 16 years in food service overall." 16 years. He savored the number like fine wine. "And in all that time, have you ever wondered what it would be like to have real money? Not tip money, not hourly wage money, real wealth. The kind that changes everything about how you move through the world." I'd learned over the years that customers often use servers as informal therapists, confessing their problems or philosophizing about life to someone they considered safely beneath them socially. Usually these conversations were harmless, lonely people seeking connection with the only person who had to listen politely. But something about his tone suggested a different kind of game. "I try to focus on doing my job well, sir," I replied diplomatically. "That's not what I asked," he pressed, leaning forward slightly. "I asked if you've ever wondered what it would be like to have serious money, investment money, the kind of assets that work while you sleep." He gestured to his phone again. "I own positions in 17 different cryptocurrencies, a diversified stock portfolio worth about $40 million, real estate in 4 countries, and a private equity stake in 3 different pharmaceutical companies. My net worth fluctuates by more in a single day than you make in an entire year." Other diners were starting to glance over, drawn by the uncomfortable tension in his voice. I could feel their attention like heat on my skin, the familiar flush of public humiliation beginning to rise from my collar. "That sounds very—" I began, but he cut me off. "Here's what I find fascinating," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "You serve people like me every day. You see our watches, our clothes, the casual way we spend more on wine than you spend on rent. But you never ask yourself why some people get to sit at these tables while others just clean them up." The dining room had grown noticeably quieter. Even the kitchen staff could sense the shift in atmosphere. Conversations at nearby tables became muted, the usual dinner theater ambiance replaced by the uncomfortable silence that accompanies public cruelty. "Sir, perhaps we could—" I attempted to redirect the conversation, but he was clearly just getting started. "It's about intelligence," he said, his voice now carrying to half the dining room. "It's about recognizing opportunities. It's about having the vision to see where technology and finance are heading, instead of just—" He gestured dismissively at my uniform. "Instead of just accepting whatever scraps fall from other people's tables." The insult landed exactly as intended, and I felt the familiar sting of public humiliation. But something else was stirring in my chest, an anger I usually kept carefully contained. This wasn't just another rude customer making casual comments. This was calculated cruelty, performed for an audience, designed to establish his dominance by diminishing my humanity. "I've made more money in the last month trading digital assets than you'll make in the next decade serving soup to your betters," he continued, apparently encouraged by my silence. "And you know what the saddest part is? You probably think this is just how the world works, that some people are born to serve and others are born to be served." A few diners were openly watching now, their conversations entirely forgotten. I could see the particular fascination that accompanies a public spectacle, the uncomfortable voyeurism of watching someone else's dignity being systematically stripped away. Some looked embarrassed on my behalf. Others seemed to be enjoying the show. "The truth is," he said, taking another sip of his expensive scotch, "you could learn to invest. You could study cryptocurrency markets, understand blockchain technology, develop the skills necessary to build real wealth. But you won't, because it's easier to just take orders and hope for tips than it is to actually better yourself. The cruelty in his words was breathtaking, but what made it worse was the grain of truth it contained. I couldn't afford to take financial risks, couldn't invest money I didn't have in markets I didn't understand. The daily struggle to pay rent and buy groceries left no room for the kind of long-term thinking that builds generational wealth. But he presented my poverty as a character flaw rather than a systemic reality. "Sir," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt in my hands, "your meal will be ready shortly. Is there anything else I can bring you while you wait?" He smiled then, clearly pleased with my professional response to his personal attack. "Just the check when I'm finished. Oh, and Maggie." He leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed in his superiority. "When you go home tonight to your little apartment in Queens, yes, I can tell exactly where you live just by looking at you. When you go home and count your tip money, remember this conversation. Remember that the difference between us isn't luck or circumstances. It's choices. It's intelligence. It's the willingness to think bigger than cleaning up after other people." The dining room was completely silent now. Even the kitchen noise had faded to a whisper. I stood there for a moment, absorbing the full impact of his calculated cruelty, feeling the eyes of 30 other diners watching to see how I would respond. This was the moment that would define the rest of the evening, possibly the rest of my employment. I could have walked away, should have walked away. In 12 years of serving entitled customers, I'd learned that dignity sometimes requires strategic retreat, that fighting back only gives cruel people more ammunition, that servers who forget their place quickly find themselves looking for new jobs. But something about his confident assumptions, his casual dismissal of my intelligence and worth, ignited a flame that had been smoldering in my chest for 16 years of swallowed insults and forced smiles. "Actually, sir," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent dining room, "I think you may have misunderstood something about cryptocurrency." His eyebrows raised slightly, surprised that I was still standing there instead of retreating to the kitchen like a scolded child. "You mentioned blockchain technology," I continued, "but I noticed you were looking at Dogecoin on your screen earlier. Did you know that Dogecoin actually runs on a fork of the Litecoin blockchain using a script algorithm rather than the SHA-256 algorithm that Bitcoin uses? It's an interesting choice for someone building a diversified crypto portfolio, since Dogecoin was originally created as a satirical commentary on cryptocurrency speculation." The silence in the room deepened. His expression shifted from amusement to confusion to something approaching alarm. This was clearly not how he'd expected this interaction to proceed. "I also noticed you were looking at pharmaceutical stocks," I added, warming to my theme. "Bristol Myers Squibb has had an interesting year. Their Opdivo immunotherapy drug brought in about $7 billion in revenue last year, which is impressive until you consider that the research and development was largely funded by taxpayer dollars through NIH grants. It's fascinating how private companies can monetize public research and then charge patients $60,000 per year for treatments their own tax money helped develop." He stared at me now with the uncomfortable attention of someone realizing they've drastically underestimated their opponent. The other diners were leaning forward, sensing that the dynamic in the room had shifted in some fundamental way. "As for your Bitcoin investments," I concluded, "I hope you're keeping good records of your transactions for tax purposes. The IRS has been particularly aggressive lately about cryptocurrency gains, especially since the reporting requirements changed last year. Failure to properly document your trades could result in some unfortunately expensive penalties." The silence that followed was different from before. Where there had been uncomfortable voyeurism, there was now something approaching respect. The businessman, who had been so confident in his intellectual superiority, now sat frozen, his expensive scotch forgotten, his phone screen dark. "Your dinner will be ready in about 10 minutes," I said, returning to my professional tone as if nothing unusual had happened. "Please let me know if you need anything else." I walked back toward the kitchen with my head high, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes following my movement. Behind me, I heard the gradual resumption of conversation as the other diners processed what they'd just witnessed. The businessman sat alone at his table, staring at his phone screen with the blank expression of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally challenged. In the kitchen, the staff was buzzing with excitement. Word had already spread through the restaurant about the exchange in the dining room. Chef Laurent, who rarely left his station during service, actually walked over to give me a respectful nod. "That was beautiful, Maggie," said Maria, still grinning. "Did you see his face when you started talking about blockchain algorithms?" I had seen his face. More importantly, I had seen the faces of the other diners. The shift from uncomfortable voyeurism to impressed attention to something approaching respect. For the first time in 16 years of service work, I had refused to accept the role of victim in someone else's power play. But even as I basked in the momentary triumph, I knew there would be consequences. Customers like him don't appreciate being publicly corrected by people they consider inferior. He would complain to management. He would demand that I be fired. He would use his wealth and influence to ensure that my moment of dignity came at the cost of my livelihood. Sure enough, when I returned to his table with his dinner, perfectly prepared Wagyu beef that cost more than my monthly rent, he was typing furiously on his phone. He barely looked up as I placed the plate in front of him, just continued his urgent texting with the intensity of someone arranging a revenge that would outlast the evening. "Will there be anything else?" I asked, maintaining my professional composure despite knowing that my employment was probably measured in hours rather than years. He looked up then, and his earlier amusement had been replaced by something much colder. "Actually, yes," he said quietly, his voice dropping to a conversational level that somehow felt more threatening than his earlier public cruelty. "There is something else." He set his phone aside and leaned forward, inviting me to bend closer as if he had a secret to share. Against my better judgment, I found myself leaning in, drawn by the shift in his demeanor from aggressive to almost intimate. That's when he whispered the words that would change everything. "I have 30 days to live." The restaurant noise faded to nothing. His breath smelled like expensive whiskey and something else. Something medical, pharmaceutical, the bitter edge of mortality that no amount of money can sweeten. His eyes, which had been cold and calculating moments before, now held a desperation so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. "Pancreatic cancer," he continued in that same whisper, his voice trembling slightly. "Stage 4. Inoperable. The best oncologists in the world, the most expensive treatments money can buy, and they give me 30 days, maybe 6 weeks if I'm lucky." I straightened up, pulling back from the intimate confession, my mind struggling to process the shift from public humiliation to private revelation. Around us, the dining room continued its elegant dance of commerce and consumption, oblivious to the fact that death had just taken a seat at table 7. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it, despite everything that had happened between us just minutes before. "Are you?" he asked, studying my face with new intensity. "Or are you thinking that maybe I deserve this? That maybe karma has finally caught up with the cruel, rich man who humiliates waitresses for sport?" The question was fair, and I considered it honestly before answering. I'm thinking that nobody deserves to die alone and afraid, no matter how they've treated other people. Something in his expression cracked then, a hairline fracture in the armor of wealth and arrogance that revealed the terrified human being underneath. "I am alone," he said simply. 47 years old, worth more than $100 million, and I'm going to die completely alone. He picked up his phone again, but instead of financial charts, the screen showed his contacts list. I could see dozens of names, business associates and social connections, but his thumb scrolled through them without stopping, as if he was looking for someone who wasn't there. No wife, he continued, his voice gaining strength as he worked through his inventory of isolation. 3 ex-wives, actually. But they were more interested in my net worth than my life expectancy. No children. I was too busy building my fortune to build a family. No friends, just business partners and people who want something from me. He took another sip of his scotch, and I noticed his hand was shaking slightly. Do you know what it's like to realize that you've spent your entire adult life accumulating wealth instead of relationships? That you've treated every human interaction as a transaction to be optimized rather than a connection to be cherished? The question hung in the air between us, complicated by the fact that I'd just witnessed him treating our interaction as exactly that kind of transaction. But there was something about his vulnerability, the raw honesty of someone facing their own mortality. That made me want to listen rather than point out the irony. My doctor told me 3 weeks ago, he said. 3 weeks and I haven't told a single person. Not because I'm private or strong, but because I literally don't have anyone to tell. The closest thing I have to a personal relationship is my financial advisor, and even that's just about managing my estate. He laughed, but it came out bitter and hollow. I have enough money to buy a small country, and I'm going to die surrounded by paid professionals who'll pretend to care because that's what they're compensated to do. Nurses, doctors, lawyers, accountants, all performing grief they don't feel for a man they don't know. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was confessing this to another paid professional, someone who was literally compensated to listen politely to whatever customers chose to share. But something about the way he was looking at me suggested he understood the parallel and found it fitting rather than insulting. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because," he said, "you're the first person in years who's seen me as something other than a source of money. When you corrected me about cryptocurrency, when you refused to let me diminish you, you were responding to me as a human being rather than a bank account with legs." He paused, considering his words carefully. "Also, because I think I owe you an apology, not because I'm dying. That doesn't excuse cruelty. But because what I did to you was wrong. You deserved better from me, regardless of our respective circumstances." The apology caught me off guard, partly because it seemed genuine and partly because wealthy customers so rarely acknowledge their behavior, let alone apologized for it. I found myself studying his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but all I saw was exhaustion and fear. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how to spend the time I have left. My lawyers are handling the financial stuff. Most of it's going to cancer research, which feels appropriately ironic. But I keep coming back to the question of how to die with some semblance of dignity. How to make the end of my life mean something other than just accumulated wealth and professional achievements." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a familiar object, his phone, but this time he set it face down on the table like someone officially going off duty. "I have a proposition," he said. "Not what you're thinking," he added quickly, reading my expression. "Nothing inappropriate or transactional, just human." I waited, curious despite myself about where this conversation was heading. I want to spend my last 30 days learning how to live like a real person, not performing wealth, not optimizing transactions, not building empire, just living. And I think you could teach me how to do that. The request was so unexpected that I initially thought I'd misunderstood. "I'm sorry, what?" "You've been serving people like me for 16 years, he said. "You've watched us waste money on things that don't matter, prioritize possessions over people, mistake financial success for life satisfaction. You've seen up close how wealth can isolate rather than connect, how privilege can become a prison." He leaned forward again, and this time his intensity felt urgent rather than threatening. "I have 30 days to learn how to be human before I die. Will you teach me?" The dining room around us continued its elegant performance, crystal glasses chiming, conversations flowing, servers moving with practiced precision between tables of people who understood their roles in this particular theater. But our table had become something else entirely, a small island where the usual rules no longer applied. "I don't understand what you're asking," I said honestly. "I'm asking you to show me how normal people live," he replied. "How they find joy in small things, how they connect with each other, how they build relationships that matter more than assets portfolios. You work with your hands, you interact with people. You've maintained your humanity despite years of serving people who forgot theirs." He gestured around the dining room. "Everyone here knows how to spend money, but I don't think any of us remember how to live with purpose. You do. I saw it tonight when you refused to let me make you invisible. I want to learn that kind of strength." The request was so far outside my experience that I struggled to formulate a response. In 16 years of service work, I'd been asked to bring extra bread, fetch different wines, accommodate dietary restrictions, and tolerate personal abuse. I'd never been asked to serve as a life coach for a dying millionaire's crash course in humanity. "I have to work," I said finally. "I can't just take 30 days off to—" "I'll cover it," he interrupted. "Whatever you make here, whatever you need to pay your bills. Consider it handled. This isn't about money for you, it's about time for me." The offer hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. On one hand, it was clearly the desperate gesture of a man facing his own mortality, probably doomed to disappoint us both. On the other hand, it represented something I'd never had before, the luxury of time, the freedom to choose how to spend my days rather than simply surviving them. "What exactly would you want me to do?" I asked. "Show me how you live when you're not here," he said. "Where you shop, how you cook, what makes you laugh, who you spend time with. Show me what a life built on relationships rather than transactions looks like." He paused, then added with surprising vulnerability, "I've never had a friend, Maggie. I've had business associateship and social connections and people who wanted access to my wealth, but I've never had someone who just enjoyed my company. I want to know what that feels like before I die." The request was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Here was a man who had spent his entire adult life accumulating wealth and influence, only to realize too late that he'd built a fortune without building a life. His greatest achievement, the thing that defined him and gave him power in the world, had also isolated him from the basic human experiences that give life meaning. "Why me?" I asked. "You could hire counselors, life coaches, spiritual advisors." "Because," he said, "you're real. You told me the truth tonight when it would have been safer to stay quiet. You treated me like a human being who could be better rather than a monster who deserved scorn. And because—" He hesitated, then continued with obvious difficulty. "Because I think you might be the only person I've met in years who would miss me for reasons that have nothing to do with money." The admission was so raw, so desperately honest, that I felt my professional composure beginning to crack. This wasn't just another wealthy customer making demands. This was a human being facing the ultimate deadline, with the growing realization that he'd wasted his life on things that couldn't love him back. "I need to think about it," I said. "Of course," he replied immediately. "Take all the time you need, but remember, I don't have very much time to spare." He reached for his wallet then and pulled out a business card that was simple to the point of severity. Just his name, Richard Hamilton, and a phone number. No company logo, no titles, no indication of the vast fortune attached to that simple information. "My number," he said, placing the card next to his untouched dinner. "Call me when you decide, or don't call, if that's what you choose. Either way, thank you for treating me like a human being tonight. It's been longer than I care to admit since someone did that." He stood up then, leaving his expensive dinner barely touched, his $250 scotch half finished, the bottle of wine he'd ordered still unopened. He placed $500 bills on the table, more than I usually made in a week, without any of the ceremony that usually accompanied such grand gestures. "For your time," he said quietly, "and your patience, and your kindness." He walked out of the restaurant without looking back, leaving me standing at the table 7 with his business card in my hand and a decision that would define the next 30 days of my life. Around me, the dining room slowly returned to its normal rhythm, conversations resuming, servers clearing tables, the theater of fine dining continuing its nightly performance. But something had changed in that elegant space, some fundamental shift in the way I understood the relationship between wealth and worth, between serving and being served, between the powerful and the powerless. For the first time in my career, a customer had asked for something I didn't know how to provide, not because I lacked the skills, but because I'd never considered that my ordinary life might have value to someone else. I walked back to the kitchen with his business card in my uniform pocket, feeling its weight like a small stone that could either anchor me or help me skip across the surface of a life I'd never imagined possible. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of automatic motions and distracted thoughts. I served entrees and poured wine and managed dessert orders, but part of my mind remained fixated on the conversation at table 7. Other customers noticed my distraction. I forgot to refill water glasses, mixed up orders at table 12, and had to apologize twice for delayed service. But nobody complained. Word had spread through the dining room about my exchange with the cryptocurrency millionaire, and there was a new respect in how people spoke to me. As if witnessing me refuse to accept humiliation had elevated my status from invisible servant to something approaching human being. When my shift finally ended at midnight, I walked out into the February cold with Richard Hamilton's business card in my pocket and 1,000 questions in my head. The subway ride back to Queens gave me 45 minutes to think, watching the city lights blur past while tired commuters dozed in their seats around me. What kind of person asks a stranger to teach them how to live? What kind of desperation drives someone to confess their terminal diagnosis to a waitress they'd been cruel to just hours before? And what kind of choice was I being asked to make between the predictable struggle of my current life and 30 days with a man whose wealth could change my circumstances forever, but whose mortality reminded me that some things can't be purchased? My apartment welcomed me with its familiar smells and shadows. I made a cup of tea and sat at my small table, Richard's business card propped against the salt shaker like a tiny monument to possibility. $500 in cash lay next to my keys, more money than I usually handled at one time, but feeling somehow less significant than the choice it represented. I thought about what he'd said about learning to live like a real person. The implication was that his wealth had somehow made him artificial, isolated from authentic experience by layers of privilege and power. But what did I know about authentic living? I spent most of my waking hours in service to other people's comfort, smiling at their rudeness, accommodating their demands, measuring my worth in tip percentages and customer satisfaction. Was my life more authentic because I struggled financially? Or was I just as trapped as he was, just in a different kind of prison? He was isolated by wealth. I was isolated by poverty. He couldn't connect with people because they saw him as a source of money. I couldn't connect with people because I was always working to serve them. Maybe we were both performing versions of ourselves rather than living genuine lives. But there was something appealing about his request to learn about relationships that mattered more than financial transactions. In 16 years of service work, I'd become expert at managing relationships that were fundamentally transactional, pleasant enough to encourage tips, professional enough to maintain boundaries, accommodating enough to ensure repeat customers. But when was the last time I'd had a conversation that wasn't about taking orders or fulfilling someone else's needs? I picked up my phone and stared at his number for a long time before finally typing a simple text message. "When would you want to start?" His response came back immediately as if he'd been waiting by his phone. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. I know it's short notice, but time isn't something I can afford to waste." "What should I wear?" I typed back, then immediately felt foolish for asking. "Whatever makes you comfortable," he replied. We're not going anywhere that requires performance." I set the phone aside and tried to imagine what the next day would look like. Where would I take a dying millionaire to teach him about authentic living? What did I do with my days off that might offer insights into humanity that his wealth hadn't provided? My life outside the restaurant was small, quiet, built around necessity rather than adventure. But maybe that was exactly what he needed to see. The next morning, I woke up without an alarm for the first time in months. No need to catch the early subway, no need to arrive at the restaurant before dawn to prep for the lunch crowd. Instead, I sat by my window with coffee and watched the sun rise over Queens, painting the apartment buildings in soft gold light that made even my neighborhood look almost beautiful. Richard had suggested meeting at a small cafe in my neighborhood rather than somewhere in Manhattan, which I appreciated. Taking a dying millionaire to the Upper East Side would have felt like playing tourist in my own life. But bringing him to Queens, to the coffee shop where I occasionally treated myself to a weekend breakfast, felt more honest somehow. The cafe was called Maya's, run by a Guatemalan woman who'd been serving the neighborhood for 15 years. The walls were painted bright yellow, decorated with photographs of Antigua and maps of Central America. The coffee was strong and bitter, served in heavy ceramic mugs that retained heat. The clientele was mostly working people, nurses finishing overnight shifts, construction workers grabbing breakfast before job sites, elderly neighbors who treated the place like a community center. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, partly so I could watch for Richard, and partly so I could escape quickly if this whole experiment felt too awkward to continue. Maya herself brought me coffee without being asked, along with a warm smile that reminded me why I'd chosen this place. Here, I wasn't invisible. Here, I was a neighbor. Richard arrived exactly on time, but he looked different than he had in the restaurant. Gone was the expensive suit, replaced by dark jeans and a simple wool sweater. His Italian leather shoes had been swapped for worn sneakers. Without the armor of obvious wealth, he looked younger, more vulnerable, more human. He also looked nervous. "Maggie," he said, sliding into the chair across from me, "thank you for agreeing to this. I half convinced myself you wouldn't show up." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "This is probably the strangest request I've ever received." Maya approached our table with her usual warmth, greeting me in Spanish-accented English and casting a curious glance at Richard. I ordered my usual eggs over easy with black beans and toast. Richard studied the handwritten menu with the concentration of someone deciphering ancient text. "What's good here?" he asked. "Everything," I said. "Maya's been cooking the same recipes for 15 years. Her husband grows the coffee beans on their farm in Guatemala, ships them here directly." He nodded and ordered the same thing I'd gotten, which made Maya smile approvingly. After she walked away, Richard looked around the cafe with the attention of someone seeing a world he'd never noticed before. "It's interesting," he said. "Everyone seems to know each other." "It's a neighborhood place," I explained. "People come here for years, decades sometimes. Maya knows everyone's usual order, asks about their families, remembers their birthdays." "And the business model works?" he asked, then caught himself. "Sorry, I'm always thinking in financial terms. It's hard to turn off." "She owns the building," I said. "Bought it 20 years ago when the neighborhood was rougher. Now it's worth probably 10 times what she paid, but she'll never sell. This place is her life, not just her business." Richard nodded thoughtfully, making mental notes about something I couldn't identify. Our breakfast arrived quickly. Simple food prepared with care, served on mismatched plates that had been accumulated over years rather than purchased as a set. Everything about the meal emphasized function over form, substance over presentation. "This is excellent," Richard said after his first bite, and he sounded genuinely surprised. "Were you expecting it to be bad?" I asked. "I was expecting it to be different," he said carefully. "I usually eat at places where the presentation is more important than the taste. This actually tastes like food rather than performing like food." We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. him apparently absorbing the atmosphere while I tried to understand what exactly I was supposed to be teaching him. The cafe around us filled with its usual morning crowd, people heading to work, retirees settling in for long conversations, parents juggling coffee cups and small children. "Tell me about your neighborhood," Richard said eventually. "How long have you lived here?" 8 years in this apartment, I said. 12 years in Queens overall. I moved here from the Bronx when I got the job at Chez Laurent. By choice? He asked. Or because of rent? Both, I said honestly. It's what I could afford, but I also liked the feeling of the area. More diverse than where I grew up. More alive. He looked out the window at the mix of apartment buildings, small businesses, and tree-lined streets that defined my corner of Queens. "I live on the Upper East Side," he said. "Penthouse with Central Park views, concierge service, private elevator. I pay more in monthly maintenance fees than most people make in a year." "Do you like it?" I asked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. "I never thought about whether I liked it," he said slowly. "I bought it because it was expensive and exclusive, because I could afford it and most people couldn't. But actually liking it?" He considered this. "I don't think I've spent enough time there to develop an opinion. I'm usually traveling or working or eating at restaurants like Laurent's." "What do you do when you're home?" I asked. "Work," he said immediately. "Check international markets, review investment portfolios, plan acquisitions." He paused. "Watch financial news, research cryptocurrency trends, network with other investors." "For fun," I clarified. Another pause. "That is fun for me, or it was, anyway. Making money, building wealth, executing successful trades, that was what I enjoyed. And now? Now it seems pointless," he said simply. "You can't take investment portfolios with you when you die. Bitcoin doesn't comfort you when you're afraid. Stock dividends don't hold your hand in the hospital." Maya refilled our coffee cups, inquiring in her gentle way about whether we needed anything else. Her attention felt genuine rather than transactional. She cared about our comfort because we were sitting in her space, not because she was calculating potential tips. "This is what I mean," Richard said after Maya walked away. "She just treated us like people. Not potential sources of revenue or network connections or business opportunities, just humans who might want more coffee." "That's how most people treat each other," I said, "when you're not in environments designed around wealth and status." "Is it?" he asked, and the question was tinged with something like wonder. I honestly wouldn't know. I haven't spent time in non-transactional environments in decades. After breakfast, we walked through my neighborhood. I showed him the small grocery store where I shopped. Run by a Pakistani family who always asked about my mother's health, even though I'd never mentioned having a mother. We passed the laundromat where I spent Sunday mornings, the used bookstore where I browsed mysteries and romances I couldn't afford to buy, the community garden where neighbors grew tomatoes and peppers and shared the harvest with anyone who needed fresh vegetables. "Everyone speaks to you," Richard observed after we'd walked for about 20 minutes. "It's a small neighborhood," I said. "People notice each other." "But they seem to genuinely like you," he pressed. "The man at the grocery store, the woman walking her dog, even the teenagers at the bus stop. They all smile when they see you." I hadn't really thought about it, but he was right. Over the years, I'd developed casual friendships with dozens of neighbors. Nothing deep or time-consuming, just the kind of regular human contact that makes a place feel like home rather than just an address. "I try to be pleasant," I said, which felt like an inadequate explanation. "So do I," Richard said. "At business meetings, social events, networking functions, but nobody looks at me the way these people look at you." "How do they look at me?" "Like they're happy to see you," he said simply. "Like your presence makes their day a little better." We ended up at a small park where I sometimes sat on my days off, reading library books or just watching people. It wasn't fancy. A few benches, some old swings, basketball court with torn nets, but it was green and quiet, a pocket of peace in the urban landscape. I own stock in the company that manages Central Park, Richard said as we settled onto a bench, but I don't think I've ever just sat in a park before. What do you mean? I mean, I've walked through parks as shortcuts between meetings, or attended charity events in park settings, or jogged through them while talking on the phone. But I've never just sat, watched, listened. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching an elderly man feed pigeons, listening to children play on the swings, observing the small dramas of urban life unfold around us. A young mother pushed her toddler on the swings while talking on the phone in Spanish. Two old men played chess at a concrete table, their game interrupted by frequent arguments and laughter. A teenager practiced basketball shots with the concentration of someone whose dreams depended on perfect form. "It's peaceful," Richard said eventually. "Even with all the noise?" I asked, because the park was actually quite active. "It's human noise," he said. "People living their lives, not performing them. There's something restful about being around people who aren't trying to impress anyone." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself relaxing into the strangeness of the situation. Richard asked thoughtful questions about everything: how I'd chosen my apartment, why I shopped at certain stores, what I did on weekends, who I called when I needed help. His curiosity felt genuine rather than intrusive, as if he was trying to understand a foreign culture he'd never encountered. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said as we walked back toward my neighborhood. "You've been asking me personal things all day." "Fair point," he said with a slight smile, the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd seen from him. "But this is more personal. Do you ever think about having more? More money, more possessions, a bigger apartment, expensive vacations?" The question was complicated, and I considered it carefully before answering. Of course I think about it. I think about not checking my bank balance before buying groceries. I think about having enough money to visit my sister without planning for months. I think about retirement that doesn't involve working until I die. But I also know that wanting more can become a trap, I said. I've served people who have everything and still aren't satisfied, who spend their time planning acquisitions instead of enjoying what they already have. I paused, then added, "I think the difference is whether you want more in order to experience life differently, or whether you want more because you think accumulating things will somehow change who you are." Richard was quiet for several blocks, apparently processing this distinction. "I wanted more because I thought it would make me matter," he said finally. "I thought wealth was proof that I was important, intelligent, valuable. But all it actually proved was that I was good at making money. And now I realize that spending 30 years building a fortune was easier than spending 30 minutes learning to be human," he said. "I can analyze market trends and execute complex trades, but I don't know how to be a friend. I can manage a portfolio worth hundreds of millions, but I don't know how to find joy in a cup of coffee or a conversation in the park." We stopped outside Maya's cafe, where our day had begun hours earlier. The late afternoon light painted the yellow walls in warm orange tones, and the windows glowed with the comfortable light of a place where people gathered regularly. "Thank you," Richard said. "Today was educational in ways I didn't expect." "What did you learn?" I asked, curious about his perspective on our ordinary day. "I learned that wealth is isolating," he said slowly, "that when you can buy anything, nothing feels particularly special. That when people only interact with you because of your money, you never learn how to be interesting without it." He looked back at the cafe. "I also learned that happiness might be more about finding the right people to share simple things with than about accumulating impressive things to enjoy alone." "Same time tomorrow?" I asked, surprised to find that I was hoping he'd say yes. "If you're willing," he said. "I have 29 days left, and apparently a lot to learn." That night, I lay awake thinking about our day together. Something about Richard's desperate curiosity had made me see my own life differently, not as a series of limitations and compromises, but as a collection of conscious choices about what mattered. I'd chosen my neighborhood for its warmth rather than its status. I'd chosen Maya's Cafe for its community rather than its presentation. I'd chosen work that brought me into contact with people rather than isolation that might have been more comfortable. Maybe authenticity wasn't about money at all. Maybe it was about being genuinely present in whatever life you were actually living, rather than performing for an audience that didn't really know you. Richard had given me an unexpected gift, the realization that my ordinary life might have value that couldn't be measured in dollars or displayed as status symbols. Tomorrow, I would try to show him more of what that meant. His text message came late that night. "Thank you for today. I slept better than I have since the diagnosis. Same time tomorrow?" I typed back, "Yes, bring comfortable shoes. We're taking the subway." For the first time in months, I fell asleep smiling. The next morning brought rain that turned Queens into a study in gray and silver. I met Richard at the subway entrance, impressed to see that he'd taken my shoe advice seriously, worn sneakers instead of Italian leather, a practical jacket instead of an expensive coat. He looked like someone preparing for adventure rather than performing wealth. "Have you ever taken public transportation?" I asked as we descended into the subway system. "Not since college," he admitted. "I've had a driver for the past 15 years. The morning rush hour subway was a crash course in urban humanity. Construction workers with coffee-stained hands, nurses finishing overnight shifts, office workers scrolling through phones, students with headphones and textbooks. Richard observed everything with the fascination of someone discovering a parallel universe that had existed alongside his life without his awareness. "It's more efficient than I expected," he said as our train pulled into the station. "When it works," I said, "but efficiency isn't really the point. It's about shared experience. Everyone on this train is going somewhere, has something important enough to leave home for. There's something democratic about that." We rode into Manhattan, and I watched Richard process the casual intimacy of subway travel. Strangers pressed together in temporary community, the unspoken social contract of shared space, the way people made eye contact or avoided it, offered seats or didn't, moved through the car with practiced urban choreography. "Where are we going?" he asked as we emerged into the gray Manhattan morning. "To see where your food comes from before it reaches restaurants like Laurent's," I said. The green market at Union Square was just setting up when we arrived. Farmers from upstate New York arranging displays of winter vegetables, bakers laying out fresh bread, cheesemakers offering samples of their morning's work. The air smelled like fresh earth and baking pastries, a sharp contrast to the artificial, climate-controlled environment where Richard usually ate. "I buy my groceries here when I can afford to," I explained as we walked between the stalls. "It costs more than the supermarket, but you're buying directly from the people who grow the food. You know where it came from, how it was raised." Richard stopped at a vegetable stand run by a young couple who clearly took pride in their organic carrots and potatoes. The woman behind the stand explained their farming practices with the kind of passion usually reserved for discussing love affairs or religious conversions. She talked about soil composition, seasonal planting, the significance of sustainable agriculture with an enthusiasm that made even root vegetables seem exciting. "You can taste the difference," she insisted, offering Richard a sample of raw turnip that somehow managed to be sweet and earthy at the same time. He bought vegetables he had no idea how to prepare, asking questions about cooking methods with the earnestness of someone taking notes for a final exam. The farmers treated him like a curious neighbor rather than a potential customer, sharing family recipes and preservation techniques as if he were joining their community rather than conducting a transaction. "This is completely different from how I usually buy food," Richard said as we walked away with bags of parsnips and winter squash. "How do you usually buy food?" "I don't," he said. "My housekeeper stocks my kitchen, or I eat at restaurants, or I have meals delivered. I haven't been to a grocery store in years, let alone bought directly from farmers." We spent the morning moving through different stalls, tasting honey from upstate apiaries, learning about heritage apples from an orchardist who spoke about his trees like beloved family members, sampling artisanal bread from a baker who'd started her business in her apartment kitchen before building it into a small empire based on perfect sourdough. "Everyone here loves what they do," Richard observed. "Most of them do," I agreed. "But it's not just about loving your work. It's about doing work that connects you to other people in meaningful ways. The baker feeds families. The farmers nourish their community. The cheesemaker creates something that brings people pleasure." "And I move money around," Richard said quietly. "I create wealth, but not anything that people actually need." "Money serves a purpose too," I said, not wanting to diminish his life's work entirely. "Investment capitalism funds innovation, helps businesses grow, enables economic development." "That's what I tell myself," he said. "But when I look at these people, I see purpose that's immediate and tangible. When the baker sells a loaf of bread, someone's family has dinner tonight. When I execute a successful trade, my portfolio gets bigger." We bought ingredients for lunch and headed back to my apartment in Queens. My small kitchen wasn't designed for elaborate cooking, but it was perfectly adequate for the simple meal we'd planned: roasted vegetables, fresh bread, cheese from the market, fruit for dessert. "I've never cooked with someone before," Richard said as we unpacked our purchases. "Never? I've attended cooking classes as social events, and I've watched professional chefs prepare meals at dinner parties, but I've never actually chopped vegetables with another person." The confession was heartbreaking in its implications. Here was a man who had accumulated enough wealth to buy restaurants, but had never experienced the simple intimacy of preparing a meal with someone he enjoyed spending time with. I handed him a knife and showed him how to dice the onions we'd bought. His technique was clumsy but enthusiastic, and he approached the task with the concentration of someone learning a foreign language. We worked side by side in my narrow kitchen, bumping elbows occasionally, laughing when he cut the carrots into dramatically uneven pieces, discussing seasoning with the seriousness of chemistry students. "This is strangely satisfying," he said as we arranged the vegetables on a baking sheet. "Cooking can be therapeutic," I said. "There's something grounding about working with your hands, creating something nourishing, sharing the results." While the vegetables roasted, we sat at my small table and talked. Without the distraction of restaurants or public spaces, our conversation became more personal, more honest. Richard talked about his childhood in suburban Pennsylvania, his parents' divorce when he was 12, his early fascination with money as a source of security in an uncertain world. "I started trading stocks when I was 15, he said. "My father had lost most of our savings in some bad investments, and I became obsessed with the idea that financial knowledge could prevent that kind of vulnerability." "Did it work?" I asked. "Too well," he said. "I became so good at making money that I forgot why I'd wanted it in the first place. Security became accumulation, became obsession. Instead of building wealth to support the life I wanted, I started living only to build more wealth." The vegetables finished roasting, filling my small apartment with the smell of caramelized onions and roasted parsnips. We arranged our simple meal on mismatched plates, opened the bottle of wine Richard had insisted on buying, and made a toast to ordinary pleasures extraordinarily experienced. "This is the best meal I've had in years," Richard said, and I believed him. "It's just roasted vegetables." "It's not just anything," he corrected gently. "It's food we chose together, prepared together, shared together. There's nothing transactional about it. No one is performing service, no one is paying for experience. It's just human." After lunch, we walked through my neighborhood again, but this time Richard began to interact more naturally with the people we encountered. He asked the grocery store owner about his family in Pakistan, complimented the woman at the laundromat on her grandchildren's photos, listened attentively while the elderly man feeding pigeons explained his theory about urban bird behavior. "You're learning," I said as we sat in the small park again. "Learning what?" "How to be interested in people without wanting anything from them," I said. how to have conversations that exist just because humans enjoy connecting with each other. It's easier than I expected, he said, and harder. Easier because people are generally kind when you approach them with genuine curiosity. Harder because I keep catching myself trying to network, looking for angles, thinking about how relationships could be useful rather than just enjoyable. That evening, as we sat in Maya's cafe drinking coffee and watching the dinner crowd filter through, Richard asked me the question I'd been expecting since our first day together. "Why are you doing this, Maggie? Really doing this?" "Not because of the money. I know you well enough now to understand that you're not motivated primarily by financial gain. So why are you spending your free time with a dying stranger?" The question deserved an honest answer, and I took time to consider carefully before responding. "Partly because I've never been asked to see my life as valuable to someone else," I said slowly. "You made me realize that what I thought of as just getting by might actually be living intentionally, that my choices about community and simplicity and human connection might have wisdom that wealth couldn't provide." I paused, then continued. "But mostly because I recognize something in you that I've felt myself. That sense of having built a life that looks successful from the outside but feels empty from the inside. The difference is that I've had to find meaning despite financial limitations, while you've been searching for meaning despite financial abundance." "And have you found it?" he asked. "Meaning?" "Some days," I said honestly. "In conversations like this, in neighbors who remember my name, in small kindnesses that don't cost anything, in the satisfaction of doing work well, even when the work isn't particularly prestigious." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I used to think that meaningful work required some kind of grand impact, legacy-building achievement. But watching you interact with people today, I'm starting to think that meaning might be more about the quality of attention you bring to ordinary interactions." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it's about understanding that your life affects other people whether you intend it to or not, so you might as well affect them positively." As we prepared to part ways for the evening, Richard thanked me again for the day. 28 days left, he said. "I'm beginning to understand what I've been missing." "What's that?" "The difference between having a life and living a life," he said simply. That night, I called my sister Nancy for the first time in months. Instead of the usual awkward conversation about my career trajectory and her suburban achievements, I asked about her daily routines, what brought her joy, how she spent time with her family. The conversation lasted 2 hours and reminded me of why I'd loved her before our lives diverged so dramatically. Richard's quest to learn how to live was teaching me to appreciate how I was already living. The third day brought sunshine and the kind of crisp February air that makes New York feel full of possibility. Richard met me outside Maya's cafe wearing jeans and a wool sweater that looked expensive, but not ostentatious. He was learning to dress for experience rather than impression. "I have something to show you today," I said, "but it requires taking the subway to Brooklyn." His face lit up with an enthusiasm I wouldn't have expected from him a week earlier. "I've never been to Brooklyn." "You've lived in New York for how long?" 15 years, he said sheepishly, "but I've lived in Manhattan. Brooklyn might as well have been another country." The subway ride gave us time to talk about the previous evening. Richard had gone home to his Upper East Side penthouse and apparently spent hours walking around his apartment, seeing it with new eyes after our day of cooking together and neighborhood wandering. "I realized I don't like my apartment," he said. "I don't like anything about it. The furniture was chosen by an interior designer based on photographs in magazines. The art was purchased as investment pieces rather than because I enjoyed looking at them. Even the books on my shelves were selected to create an impression rather than because I wanted to read them." "So change it," I said. "With 28 days left to live?" "Especially with 28 days left to live," I corrected. "If you don't have time to pretend anymore, you have freedom to be authentic." Brooklyn greeted us with an energy that felt different from both Manhattan and Queens. More artistic, more diverse, more consciously creative than my neighborhood, but less aggressively commercial than Manhattan. I led Richard through Park Slope toward the destination I'd chosen for our day, a community center where I volunteered occasionally, helping serve meals to elderly residents who couldn't cook for themselves. "I don't understand," Richard said as we approached the modest building. "What are we doing here?" "Something I think you need to see," I said. "People whose lives have value that can't be measured in financial terms." The Brighton Beach Community Center served a population of elderly immigrants, mostly from Eastern Europe, who had built lives in America but now found themselves isolated by language barriers, limited incomes, and the particular loneliness that comes with outliving your contemporaries. The meal program brought dozens of seniors together 3 times a week for food, conversation, and the kind of community that money can't purchase. "Maggie!" called Elena, the program director, as we entered the main room. "You brought a friend." I introduced Richard simply as someone interested in learning about community service, and Elena welcomed him with the same warmth she extended to all volunteers. Within minutes, he was helping set up folding tables while she explained the program's mission, funding challenges, and the difference it made in participants' lives. "Most of these people worked their entire lives," Elena explained as she and Richard arranged chairs. "They raised families, paid taxes, contributed to their communities, but they're invisible to most of society now, forgotten because they're old and not wealthy." The participants began arriving at 11:30, women in worn coats but careful makeup, men walking with canes but maintaining dignity, people whose faces told stories of displacement and resilience, and the particular courage required to build new lives in a foreign country during middle age. Richard helped serve food and found himself in halting conversations with Russian speakers practicing their English, Holocaust survivors sharing stories of adaptation, Cuban refugees describing families left behind. His initial awkwardness gave way to genuine fascination as he realized that many of these people had experience with loss, starting over, finding meaning after everything familiar had been stripped away. "This woman," I told him quietly as we ladled soup, "was a doctor in Russia. She's been cleaning office buildings for 20 years because her medical credentials weren't recognized here. But she still helps people, translates for them at doctor's appointments, gives advice about managing chronic conditions." "And him?" Richard asked, indicating an elderly man helping a woman with mobility issues navigate the buffet line. Holocaust survivor who lost his entire family but managed to build a new life in America. He volunteers here because he says helping others helps him remember why survival was worth the effort. Richard was quiet for the rest of the meal service, but I could see him processing what he was witnessing. These were people who had faced genuine loss, real displacement, authentic challenges, but had found ways to create meaning and community despite material limitations. During the cleanup after lunch, Richard approached Elena with obvious nervousness. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "What would it cost to expand this program? To serve more people, maybe offer additional services?" Elena's eyes lit up as she explained the center's wish list. Better kitchen equipment, funding for transportation so mobility-impaired seniors could attend more regularly, money for educational programs and social activities beyond the meal service. "About $50,000 would transform what we're able to offer," she said. "But we apply for grants constantly, coordinate fundraising events, stretch every dollar as far as possible." Richard nodded thoughtfully, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he spent the rest of our time at the center, asking detailed questions about operations, impact, sustainability, approaching Elena's work with the same analytical attention he'd once reserved for investment opportunities. As we rode the subway back to Queens that afternoon, Richard was unusually quiet. Finally, he turned to me and asked, "How did you know?" "Know what?" "That I needed to see that," he said. "That I needed to understand what actual service looks like." I didn't know, I said honestly. I just thought you might benefit from spending time around people who had found ways to matter to each other without money being part of the equation. Those people have more dignity than anyone I usually spend time with, he said quietly. They've lost everything: countries, languages, families, careers, but they still show up for each other. They still find ways to be useful, to contribute, to care. And I've spent my entire adult life accumulating wealth as if it was going to somehow insulate me from the kind of losses they've experienced, as if having enough money would mean I'd never have to face displacement or loneliness or irrelevance. He looked out the subway window at Brooklyn passing by, neighborhoods full of people creating lives and communities with whatever resources they had available. But wealth didn't protect me from any of that, he continued. I'm dying alone despite having more money than I could spend in a lifetime. Those people have found ways to build community despite having almost nothing. Which one of us actually understands how to live? That evening, we returned to Maya's cafe for dinner. The familiar warmth of the yellow walls and mismatched furniture felt comforting after our day of encountering new perspectives. Maya herself remembered Richard from our previous visits and greeted him like a regular customer, asking about his day and recommending her evening special with the kind of personal attention that can't be purchased. I've been thinking, Richard said as we shared flan and coffee, about what I want to do with the rest of my time. And I want to give away my money, he said simply. Not all of it. I need enough to handle medical expenses and final arrangements. But the bulk of it, I want to find places where it can actually make a difference. The statement was so matter-of-fact that it took me a moment to process its implications. That's a big decision, I said carefully. It's the first decision I've made in years that feels completely right, he replied. I've been hoarding wealth as if it was going to somehow grant me immortality, but it can't. What it can do is improve other people's lives after I'm gone. He pulled out his phone, not to check stock prices as I'd seen him do countless times, but to make notes about the community center. Elena's program could serve twice as many people with proper funding, he said, and there are probably hundreds of similar programs throughout the city that are struggling for resources, while I have millions sitting in investment accounts, earning money I'll never use. Are you sure about this? I asked. It's not reversible. Nothing about dying is reversible, he said with a slight smile, but this feels like something I can control. I can't control how much time I have left, but I can control how that time matters. Over the next hour, Richard outlined his plan. He wanted to establish a foundation focused on community programs like Elena's, services that supported elderly populations, neighborhood programs that built connection across economic and cultural divides, initiatives that helped people create meaning and community, regardless of their financial circumstances. I want to call it the Authenticity Foundation, he said, because everything you've shown me this week has been about the difference between authentic living and performed living. 27 days left, I said. That's not much time to establish a foundation. Then we'd better get started, he said with more energy than I'd seen from him since our first meeting. As we prepared to leave the cafe, Richard took out his wallet to pay our check, but instead of his usual black American Express card, he pulled out cash, wrinkled bills that looked like they'd been through actual circulation, rather than just transferred between platinum accounts. I'm learning to use money differently, he explained when he saw my surprised expression, to use it for connection rather than separation. Maya accepted the cash with her usual warmth, thanking us for choosing her restaurant and inviting us to return soon. As we stepped out into the cool Brooklyn evening, Richard asked if I would help him the next day with something he'd never done before. What's that? I want to visit my parents' graves in Pennsylvania, he said. I haven't been there since the funeral 10 years ago. But I think I need to tell them what I'm learning about how to live before it's too late. The request felt intensely personal, and I was honored that he trusted me to witness something so private. Of course, I said, "But why do you want me there?" "Because," he said, "you're the only person I know who understands the difference between wealth and worth, and I think they would have liked you." That night, I lay awake thinking about the profound changes I'd witnessed in Richard over just 3 days. He was still the same person who had humiliated me at Chez Laurent, but he was also becoming someone entirely different, someone curious rather than arrogant, open rather than calculating, focused on contribution rather than accumulation. His transformation was teaching me something important about the possibilities that exist within everyone, regardless of how they've chosen to live up to that point. People aren't fixed in their patterns. Circumstances can create opportunities for growth, for change, for becoming the person you were always capable of being. But I was also aware that his transformation was happening under the pressure of terminal diagnosis. Would he have been capable of this growth without the deadline imposed by mortality? Would any of us choose to examine our lives so honestly without the urgency that comes from knowing our time is limited? Maybe that was the real lesson. Maybe the threat of death wasn't what made life meaningful. Maybe it just made the need for meaning impossible to ignore. The 4th day began before dawn, with Richard picking me up in a rental car that was practical rather than luxurious, a compact sedan chosen for reliability rather than impression. He looked nervous but determined, carrying a small bouquet of flowers that I was sure he'd never purchased for anyone while they were alive. The drive to Pennsylvania gave us 2 hours to talk about family, loss, and the particular regrets that come from realizing you've misunderstood important relationships until after they've ended. Richard spoke about his parents with a mixture of love and guilt, love for the people they'd been, guilt for the son he'd become. "They were proud of my financial success," he said as we drove through the suburbs where he'd grown up. "But I think they were confused by the person I became in pursuit of that success. They invited me to holiday dinners that I skipped for business trips. They asked about my personal life, and I talked about portfolio performance instead." "Do you think they understood that you were trying to prove something to them?" I asked. "I think they would have preferred that I prove I was happy rather than prove I was successful," he said quietly. The cemetery was small and peaceful, located in a town that had once been prosperous but now showed signs of economic decline. Empty storefronts, houses that needed paint, the particular sadness that comes from places where dreams have been downsized by economic realities. Richard's parents were buried under a simple headstone that gave their names, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Parents and Grandparents." "Grandparents?" I asked. "My sister's children," Richard explained. "She lives in Oregon now with her husband and 2 kids. I send expensive gifts at Christmas and birthdays, but I haven't visited in 5 years." We stood in silence for several minutes, Richard apparently gathering courage for a conversation he'd rehearsed during the drive, but wasn't sure how to begin. "Mom, Dad," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I brought a friend to meet you. Her name is Maggie, and she's teaching me things I should have learned from you but was too stubborn to understand." He knelt and placed the flowers on their grave, his expensive jeans getting stained by the damp earth. "I'm sorry I became someone you didn't recognize," he continued. "I'm sorry I thought proving I was successful was more important than proving I was kind. I'm sorry I didn't spend enough time with you while I could." The wind rustled through the bare trees, carrying the smell of approaching spring and the sound of distant traffic. Richard stayed kneeling, apparently having a conversation that required privacy, so I walked a short distance away to give him space for whatever he needed to say to the people who had loved him before he became wealthy. When he rejoined me 20 minutes later, his eyes were red, but his expression was clearer than I'd seen it since we'd met. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For understanding that some conversations are necessary even when they're one-sided," he said, "and for helping me become someone they might be proud of during the time I have left." The drive back to New York was quieter, both of us processing the weight of mortality and memory. the particular sadness that comes from recognizing missed opportunities that can't be recovered. 26 days, Richard said as we approached the city. I want to spend them differently than I've spent the last 15 years. How? I want to spend them with people instead of portfolios, he said. I want to spend them building something that will matter after I'm gone, instead of accumulating things that will just be distributed to lawyers and accountants. That evening, instead of our usual dinner at Maya's, Richard suggested cooking together again. We stopped at the green market for ingredients, but this time he moved through the stalls with confidence, asking farmers about their methods, tasting samples, making choices based on taste and connection rather than price and convenience. "You're getting comfortable with this," I observed as he chatted with the cheesemaker about aging processes. "I'm getting comfortable with myself," he replied. "For the first time in decades, I'm not performing wealth or networking or building towards some future achievement. I'm just being present in the conversation I'm actually having." We cooked dinner in my small kitchen again, but this time Richard took more initiative, seasoning the vegetables with confidence, suggesting wine pairings based on actual taste rather than price points. The conversation flowed easily as we worked side by side, and I found myself forgetting about his wealth and his diagnosis, just enjoying the companionship of someone who was learning to pay attention to small pleasures. "I called my sister today," he said as we sat down to eat. "First time in 8 months. I told her about the diagnosis, about meeting you, about what I'm learning." "How did she respond?" "She cried," he said simply. "Then she got angry at me for waiting so long to call. Then she invited me to visit, meet my niece and nephew properly, spend some time being an uncle instead of just a source of expensive gifts." "Will you go?" "Next week," he said. "I want to spend a few days learning what it means to be part of a family instead of just supporting one financially." After dinner, we walked through my neighborhood again, but this time our route felt like a pilgrimage to places that had become meaningful to both of us. The cafe where we'd had our first conversation about authentic living. The park where Richard had first understood the difference between human noise and performance noise. The community center in Brooklyn where he'd realized that dignity didn't require wealth. "I've been thinking about something you said," Richard told me as we sat on our favorite bench in the small park, about the difference between wanting more to experience life differently versus wanting more to change who you are. And "I think I spent 30 years trying to use money to become someone worth loving instead of learning to be loving," he said. "I thought if I accumulated enough wealth, I would somehow deserve the kind of relationships I saw other people enjoying. But wealth just isolated me from the relationships I actually wanted." A young couple walked past, holding hands and arguing quietly about something that would probably seem insignificant tomorrow but mattered intensely to them tonight. Their intimacy, even in conflict, was something Richard's wealth had never purchased. "Do you think it's possible to build authentic relationships when you know you're dying?" he asked. "I think knowing you're dying might make authentic relationships easier," I said. "When you don't have time to waste on performance or manipulation, you have to get to the truth more quickly." "Is that what we have?" he asked. "An authentic relationship?" The question surprised me with its vulnerability. Here was a man who had built an empire of financial relationships asking whether our friendship was real, whether the connection we'd developed was based on genuine affection rather than mutual benefit. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think you're the first person in years who has seen me as fully human," he said. "The first person who has been interested in my thoughts rather than my bank balance. The first person whose opinion of me matters more than their ability to provide services or opportunities." He paused, then added quietly, "I think I love you, not romantically, though I admire you enormously, but the way you love a friend who helps you become a better version of yourself." The declaration hung in the air between us, honest and vulnerable and free of any agenda beyond human connection. I realized that I felt the same way, that our strange friendship had become one of the most meaningful relationships in my life, not because of what Richard could provide financially, but because of who he was becoming in the face of mortality. "I love you too," I said simply, "and I'm honored to be part of your life during this time." We sat in comfortable silence as the evening settled around us, two people who had found unexpected friendship across the divide of wealth and circumstance, who had discovered that authentic connection was possible even under the pressure of terminal diagnosis and limited time. 25 days left, Richard said eventually. "Then we'd better make them count," I replied. That night, I received a text from Richard that I would later recognize as a turning point in our friendship. "Thank you for helping me discover that the opposite of loneliness isn't wealth. It's being known." For the first time since our friendship began, I fell asleep not thinking about how much time he had left, but about how much life we could fit into the time remaining. The next morning brought the kind of clear September light that makes every surface in New York seem to glow from within. Richard met me at Maya's cafe carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression I'd never seen before. Purposeful, excited, almost euphoric. "I've been up all night," he said as we settled into our usual table, "working on the foundation paperwork. I want to show you something." He opened the folder and spread documents across our small table: incorporation papers, mission statements, preliminary budgets for the Authenticity Foundation. But what caught my attention wasn't the legal documents. It was the passion in his voice as he explained his vision. "I want to fund programs like Elena's Community Center," he began, "but I also want to do something broader. I want to create grants for people who are building authentic communities, neighborhood initiatives, small businesses that prioritize relationships over profit, programs that help people connect across economic divides." He pulled out a list of potential recipients that he'd researched since leaving me the night before: community gardens in the Bronx, after-school programs in Queens, small businesses that hired formerly incarcerated individuals, literacy programs for elderly immigrants, neighborhood associations that organize summer block parties and winter coat drives. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a program in Brooklyn that taught financial literacy to single mothers. "They're operating on a shoestring budget, but they've helped over 200 women become financially independent. A $50,000 grant would let them serve 5 times as many people." His excitement was infectious, and I found myself leaning forward to study his notes with growing enthusiasm. This wasn't the calculated philanthropy of someone seeking tax benefits or social recognition. This was the genuine enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a way to make his resources matter. "And this," he continued, indicating a community center in Harlem that provided meals and social services to elderly residents. "They're about to lose their lease because the building's being converted to luxury condos. But if someone bought the building and donated it to them, they could continue their work indefinitely." The scope of his vision was breathtaking, but what moved me most was the way he talked about each program, not as charitable causes to fund, but as communities to join, relationships to build, opportunities to contribute to something larger than himself. "Richard," I said carefully, "this is beautiful, but are you sure you want to give away this much money? Once it's gone, it's gone." He smiled with more joy than I'd ever seen from him. "Maggie, for the first time in my adult life, I'm excited about what my money can do instead of anxious about losing it. I've been hoarding wealth like it was going to somehow prevent me from dying, but it can't. What it can do is improve people's lives after I'm gone." Maya brought our coffee and breakfast, chatting warmly about her daughter's upcoming quinceañera. As she walked away, Richard watched her with the attention of someone still learning to see service as relationship rather than transaction. "I want to ask you something," he said after Maya left. "I want you to help me run the foundation." The request was so unexpected that I nearly dropped my coffee cup. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want you to be the executive director," he said. "I can set up the legal structure and provide the funding, but you understand community in ways I'm still learning. You know how to build relationships based on genuine care rather than financial transaction. You know what authentic living looks like. The offer was overwhelming in its implications. It would mean leaving my job at Chez Laurent, stepping into a world of philanthropy and nonprofit management that I'd never experienced, taking responsibility for distributing millions of dollars to communities that needed resources but couldn't afford mistakes. I don't have experience running a foundation, I said. Neither do I, Richard replied. But you have something more important than experience. You have wisdom about what makes life meaningful. You understand community. You know how to treat people with dignity regardless of their circumstances. He leaned forward, his intensity making the conversation feel like a job interview and a marriage proposal simultaneously. I have 24 days left, he said. I can spend them setting up legal structures and financial processes, but I need someone who will carry forward the spirit of what we're trying to create. Someone who understands that the goal isn't just giving away money, but building relationships that help people thrive. The possibilities were staggering, but so were the fears. What if I couldn't handle the responsibility? What if I disappointed the communities that would depend on the foundation? What if Richard's death left me running an organization I didn't understand? I need time to think about it, I said. Of course, he replied immediately. But while you're thinking, I want to show you something else. He pulled out his phone and showed me photographs of communities that had been transformed by thoughtful philanthropy. Neighborhood centers that had become gathering places for isolated families, community gardens that had turned vacant lots into places of beauty and nourishment, small business incubators that had helped immigrant entrepreneurs build successful enterprises. This is what's possible when resources meet community wisdom, he said. This is what 30 years of accumulated wealth could become if it was used to support people like Elena, like Maya, like all the neighbors who have been building community without waiting for permission or funding. The vision was compelling, but what moved me most was Richard's transformation from someone who had used wealth to isolate himself from human connection to someone eager to use it to strengthen the communities he was only now learning to see. There's something else, he said as we prepared to leave the cafe. I want to do this work with you, but I also want to do it as myself. Not as Richard Hamilton, the millionaire philanthropist, but as Richard who is learning what it means to be human. I don't want recognition or naming rights or press coverage. I want the satisfaction of seeing these communities thrive. And after? I asked. After you're gone? After I'm gone. The foundation continues with you as its leader, he said simply. The money will be there. The legal structure will be solid, but the spirit of the work will depend on someone who understands that the goal is building relationships rather than just distributing funds. We spent the rest of the morning visiting potential grant recipients. Richard had arranged meetings with program directors throughout Brooklyn and Queens, wanting to understand their work firsthand before making funding decisions. At each stop, I watched him interact with community leaders not as a wealthy donor bestowing charity, but as someone genuinely curious about their vision and eager to support their efforts. At Elena's community center, he had detailed conversations about program expansion, transportation challenges, and the particular loneliness experienced by elderly immigrants who had lost their cultural communities. Instead of writing a check and leaving, he volunteered to help serve lunch, sitting with participants and practicing his high school Spanish with women who appreciated his efforts even when his grammar was terrible. You know, Elena told me quietly as we watched Richard help an elderly man navigate the lunch line, most donors visit once, make speeches about their generosity, and never return. But your friend seems genuinely interested in becoming part of our community. At the literacy program in Brooklyn, Richard spent 2 hours learning about the challenges faced by adults who had missed formal education opportunities due to poverty, immigration, or discrimination. The program director, a former public school teacher named Maria, explained how literacy wasn't just about reading and writing. It was about dignity, independence, and the ability to navigate systems that excluded people without formal education. We have people in their 70s learning to read for the first time, Maria explained. They come because they're tired of pretending they understand documents they're signing, tired of asking relatives to help with tasks they should be able to handle independently. Richard watched adult students working through basic reading exercises with the concentration and courage of people refusing to accept limitations that had been imposed on them by circumstances rather than ability. When one woman successfully read a paragraph aloud for the first time, the pride in her voice and the applause from her classmates created the kind of authentic joy that no amount of money could purchase directly. "This is what I want to fund," Richard told me as we left the program. "Not charity that makes donors feel good about themselves, but communities that help people discover their own power and dignity." Our final visit was to a small social enterprise in Queens that trained formerly incarcerated individuals to become master carpenters, using traditional woodworking techniques to craft custom furniture for local businesses and wealthy homeowners. The program was run by James, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had spent 20 years in prison and now channeled his understanding of redemption into helping others rebuild their lives through skilled craftsmanship. "Society tells people with criminal records that they're permanently damaged," James explained as we toured the workshop, "but everyone deserves a chance to prove that their past doesn't define their potential." Richard watched program participants working on intricate joinery, creating beautiful furniture that would sell for thousands of dollars in Manhattan shops. The concentration and pride evident in their work reminded me of Richard's own satisfaction when he'd learned to cook simple meals or volunteer at the community center. The joy that comes from creating something beautiful and useful with your own hands. "How many people go through your program each year?" Richard asked. "We can serve 12 at a time," James replied. "Each person spends 18 months learning the craft, developing business skills, building confidence. Our graduates have a 90% employment rate and almost zero recidivism." "What would it take to expand?" Richard pressed. James's eyes lit up as he described his vision for growth. Additional workshop space, more instructors, equipment for advanced techniques, partnerships with interior designers who could provide steady work for graduates. "About $200,000 would triple our capacity," James said, "but funding sources are limited for programs serving people with criminal records, no matter how successful our outcomes." As we walked back to the subway, Richard was quiet but clearly processing everything he'd seen. Finally, he turned to me with an expression I recognized as determination mixed with joy. "I want to fund all of them," he said. "Elena's community center, Maria's literacy program, James's carpentry workshop, and a dozen others like them. I want to create a network of community programs that all share the same commitment to helping people discover their dignity and potential." "That's a big commitment," I said. "It's the right commitment," he replied. "I've spent 30 years accumulating wealth without understanding what it was for. Now I know. It's for this, for communities that help people become the best versions of themselves." That evening, we returned to my apartment to review foundation documents and develop funding priorities. Richard had transformed my small kitchen table into a temporary office, spreading papers and laptops and legal documents across the surface, where we usually ate dinner together. "I've been thinking about your question," I said as we worked through grant applications. "About running the foundation." Richard looked up from his laptop with an expression that tried to appear casual but couldn't hide his hope. "I'll do it," I said simply. "But only if we can do it together for the time you have left. I want to learn from you how to think strategically about philanthropy, and I want you to continue learning from the communities we're supporting." His smile was brilliant enough to light the entire apartment. 23 days, he said. "We have 23 days to build something that will outlast both of us." "Then we'd better get to work," I replied, and reached for the first grant application. That night, I lay awake thinking about the magnitude of the decision I'd just made. In less than a week, I'd gone from serving expensive dinners to wealthy customers to accepting leadership of a multi-million-dollar foundation focused on community development and human dignity. The transition felt surreal, but also somehow inevitable, as if the 16 years I'd spent observing wealth and power from the service side had been preparation for understanding how resources could be used to build community rather than display status. Richard's text message came late. "Thank you for saying yes. I can't think of anyone better suited to carry this work forward." I typed back, "Thank you for showing me that wealth can be a tool for connection rather than isolation." 23 days, he replied. 23 days of building something beautiful, I responded, and meant every word. The next morning brought an energy that felt different from our previous days together. Instead of Richard learning to see his life differently, we were actively building something together, a foundation that would outlast his diagnosis and create lasting change in communities throughout New York City. We met at Maya's cafe at dawn, both of us carrying laptops and legal documents and a sense of shared purpose that transformed the familiar space into a temporary headquarters for social change. Maya brought coffee and breakfast without being asked, intuiting that we were engaged in work that required sustained energy and focus. "First things first," Richard said as we reviewed foundation paperwork over eggs and toast. "We need to establish clear criteria for grants so communities understand what we're looking for." Over the next 2 hours, we developed guidelines that reflected everything Richard had learned about authentic community building. Grant recipients would be programs that prioritized relationships over transactions, that helped people discover their own dignity and potential rather than creating dependency, that brought different economic and cultural communities together rather than reinforcing existing divisions. "I don't want to fund programs that just provide services," Richard explained as we refined the language. "I want to fund communities that help people become active participants in creating solutions to their own challenges." The distinction was important. Instead of traditional charity that maintained existing power structures by having wealthy donors provide for needy recipients, the Authenticity Foundation would support community-led initiatives that helped people develop their own resources and agency. "Like James's carpentry program," I said, understanding the philosophy. Instead of giving formerly incarcerated people charity, he's giving them skills and confidence that let them build independent, prosperous lives. "Exactly," Richard replied. "And Elena's Community Center doesn't just feed elderly people. It creates social connections that combat isolation and help participants support each other." Maya brought more coffee and lingered at our table, clearly curious about our intense conversation. Instead of maintaining professional distance as I would have in a restaurant, I invited her to join us. "Maya, can I ask you something?" I said. "If you had funding to expand your restaurant's community role, what would you want to do?" Her eyes lit up immediately. "I would love to offer cooking classes for teenagers after school," she said without hesitation. "Teach them about nutrition, food safety, but also about their cultural heritage through traditional recipes. So many young people in the neighborhood don't know how to cook their grandparents' food." Richard and I exchanged glances, recognizing exactly the kind of community-building initiative the foundation wanted to support. "What would something like that cost?" Richard asked. "Not much," Maya replied. "Maybe $5,000 for equipment and supplies to get started. But the real investment would be time, and I already spend all my time here anyway." After Maya returned to her other customers, Richard made notes about community-based food education programs. "This is perfect," he said. "Maya isn't asking for charity. She's asking for resources to share her knowledge and strengthen her community. The money enables her vision rather than creating dependency." We spent the morning reaching out to program directors we'd met the previous day, setting up more detailed meetings about funding possibilities. Each conversation reinforced our understanding of effective community development. The most successful programs were led by people who lived in the communities they served, who understood local culture and challenges intimately, who approached their work as relationship building rather than service provision. Elena at the community center wanted funding to hire a part-time social worker who could help participants navigate immigration services, healthcare systems, and social service programs that were often culturally and linguistically inaccessible. Maria at the literacy program needed money for childcare so parents could attend evening classes without choosing between education and family responsibilities. James at the carpentry workshop wanted to hire additional instructors so he could serve more participants while maintaining the individualized attention that made his program successful. Every request is about building capacity rather than just providing services, Richard observed as we reviewed notes from our calls. These program directors understand that sustainable change happens when communities develop their own resources and leadership. By afternoon, we had developed preliminary budgets for 12 different community programs, representing an initial commitment of approximately $800,000 in grants over the following year. For Richard, this represented less than 2% of his liquid assets, a rounding error in his investment portfolio. But for the communities we would be supporting, it represented the difference between struggling to maintain basic services and thriving as centers of neighborhood life. "I want to make the grants immediately," Richard said as we finished our calculations. "I don't want programs to wait while we develop elaborate application processes and review committees." "Are you sure?" I asked. "That's moving very fast for such significant funding decisions." "I'm sure," he replied without hesitation. "I have 22 days left to live. These communities have been waiting for resources for years. If we've identified programs that align with our values and serve genuine community needs, why would we delay funding them?" The philosophy reflected everything Richard had learned about the difference between authentic action and performative process. Traditional philanthropy often involved elaborate procedures designed to demonstrate donor sophistication and ensure recipient gratitude. Richard wanted to provide resources quickly and simply so community leaders could focus on their work rather than grant applications and donor management. "Besides," he added with a smile that carried both sadness and joy, "what's the worst that could happen? We give money to community leaders who use it to help their neighbors build better lives. That sounds like success to me." That afternoon, we visited a small business incubator in the Bronx that provided workspace, mentorship, and startup funding for immigrant entrepreneurs. The program was run by Carmen, a dynamic woman in her 40s who had built her own successful consulting business after arriving from El Salvador, with no resources except determination and business acumen. "Most traditional lenders won't work with immigrant entrepreneurs," Carmen explained as she showed us the shared workspace where a dozen small businesses were developing. No credit history, no collateral, language barriers, cultural unfamiliarity with American business practices. But these people have incredible knowledge and work ethic. They just need access to resources and guidance. We witnessed a remarkable variety of enterprises in development. A catering business specializing in authentic Honduran cuisine for corporate events, a house cleaning service that employed recently arrived refugees, a child care cooperative run by mothers who couldn't afford traditional daycare, a graphic design company created by a former journalism professor from Venezuela who was building a new career around his artistic skills. Each business creates jobs not just for the entrepreneur, but for other community members, Carmen continued. The catering company hires servers and prep cooks. The cleaning service provides income for women who need flexible schedules. The child care cooperative makes it possible for other parents to work or attend school. Richard studied the business plans and financial projections with the same attention he'd once devoted to cryptocurrency portfolios and pharmaceutical stock valuations. But instead of analyzing opportunities for personal profit, he was evaluating potential for community impact and entrepreneur success. "What's your biggest challenge?" he asked Carmen. Access to capital, she replied immediately. Traditional small business loans aren't realistic for most of our entrepreneurs, so we provide microloans through a community development financial institution. But our loan pool is limited, which means we can only serve a few businesses each year. What would expansion look like? Carmen's passion was evident as she described her vision for growth. Additional workspace for more entrepreneurs, expanded mentorship programs connecting immigrant business owners with successful professionals, financial literacy classes that helped participants understand American banking and credit systems. $100,000 in capital investment would let us serve 50 entrepreneurs instead of 12, she said. And the loan pool is revolving. As businesses succeed and repay their loans, the money becomes available for new entrepreneurs. As we toured the facility, Richard had detailed conversations with several business owners about their challenges, goals, and dreams. What impressed me was his ability to ask questions that demonstrated genuine interest in their success rather than calculation about potential returns on his investment. You're learning to think like a community member rather than an outside investor, I observed as we left the incubator. I'm learning to think like someone who wants other people to succeed rather than someone who wants to profit from other people's success, he replied. It's a completely different way of evaluating opportunities. That evening, we returned to my apartment to finalize funding decisions for our first round of grants. Richard had prepared checks for each program, not pledges or commitments that would require additional paperwork, but actual funding that community leaders could deposit immediately and put to work. This feels surreal, I said as we organized checks totaling nearly $1 million on my kitchen table. A week ago, I was serving you dinner, and you were being cruel about cryptocurrency. Now we're distributing funding that will transform communities throughout the city. A week ago, I thought wealth was about accumulation, and you thought serving me dinner was just a job, Richard replied. Now we both understand that the real value of resources is what they enable communities to create. He signed the final check and set it with the others, creating a small paper monument to possibility and change. 21 days left, he said quietly. 21 days to see these communities thrive, I replied. And a lifetime for the foundation to continue this work after you're gone. Richard reached across the table and took my hand, not romantically, but with the affection of someone who had found unexpected friendship during the most difficult period of his life. Thank you, he said simply, for helping me understand what my life could mean, for agreeing to carry this work forward, for becoming the kind of friend I never thought I deserved. Thank you, I replied, for showing me that service can be about building community rather than just accommodating wealth, for trusting me with something this important, for becoming the kind of person your parents would be proud of. We sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by checks that represented our shared commitment to communities we were still learning to understand, bound by friendship that had grown from conflict into something that would outlast Richard's diagnosis and define the rest of my life. That night, for the first time since Richard had whispered his diagnosis across a restaurant table, I fell asleep not thinking about how much time he had left, but about how much life we were going to create with the time remaining. The next morning brought news that would change the trajectory of our remaining days together. Richard arrived at Maya's cafe carrying his phone and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, not excitement or determination, but something approaching wonder. I heard from my oncologist, he said as he sat down across from me. The experimental treatment I've been taking as palliative care has had unexpected results. I set down my coffee cup, afraid to hope but unable to suppress the possibility that was rising in my chest. The tumors are shrinking, Richard continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Not just stable, actually shrinking. My doctor wants to run additional tests, but he's talking about months instead of days, possibly years instead of months. The news was so unexpected that I initially couldn't process its implications. For 3 weeks, we'd been operating under the assumption that Richard was dying, that our friendship and foundation work existed within the constraints of terminal diagnosis. Now, suddenly, the timeline had changed. "How do you feel about that?" I asked carefully. "Terrified," he said immediately, which surprised me. I thought I'd be purely relieved, but I'm actually terrified. Why? Because everything meaningful I've done in the past 3 weeks has happened under the pressure of thinking I was dying, he said. What if having more time makes me revert to accumulating wealth instead of building community? What if the urgency that made me authentic disappears when death isn't immediate? The fear was understandable. Richard's transformation from cruel millionaire to compassionate community member had happened within the context of mortality, the knowledge that he had limited time to become the person he wanted to be. Without that deadline, would he maintain the same commitment to authenticity and service? "Do you want to revert?" I asked. He considered the question seriously before responding. "No," he said finally. "The person I've become in the past 3 weeks feels more like who I actually am than the person I was for the previous 30 years. I don't want to lose that." "Then don't lose it," I said simply. "Having more time doesn't mean you have to waste it. It just means you have more opportunities to build the life you've discovered you want." Maya brought our usual breakfast without being asked, greeting Richard with the kind of warmth that had become routine over our weeks of morning meetings. Her easy affection represented the type of relationship he'd never experienced before our friendship began. Connection based on genuine appreciation, rather than financial transaction. "There's something else," Richard said as we ate. "My doctor wants me to consider aggressive treatment that might extend my life significantly. But it would involve months of chemotherapy, surgery, recovery. I'd have to spend the next year fighting cancer instead of building community." The decision he was facing wasn't just medical, it was philosophical. He could pursue aggressive treatment that might grant him years of additional life, but those years would be consumed by hospitals and side effects and the particular suffering that comes with battling terminal illness. Or he could continue palliative care that maintained his current quality of life for whatever time remained, whether that was months or years. "What does your intuition tell you?" I asked. "That I'd rather spend 6 months living fully than 18 months fighting to stay alive," he said without hesitation. "I've discovered what it means to be human, and I don't want to spend whatever time I have left being a patient instead of a person." The decision reflected everything he'd learned about the difference between authentic living and performed living. Aggressive cancer treatment would be performing life, fighting to accumulate more days without considering what those days would contain. Palliative care would allow him to continue living authentically, focused on relationships and community rather than simply extending biological existence. "Have you told your sister?" I asked. "I called her this morning," he said. "She wants me to fight, to try everything available, to spend whatever money it takes to beat this cancer." And I told her that beating cancer isn't the same as living well," he said quietly. "I told her I'd rather spend the time I have left being her brother than being a cancer patient." After breakfast, we walked through my neighborhood toward the small park where we'd had many of our most important conversations. The late morning light painted familiar streets in the golden tones that made even modest apartment buildings look elegant, and Richard greeted neighbors with the easy familiarity he'd developed over our weeks together. "I've been thinking about what this news means for the foundation," he said as we settled onto our usual bench. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I might have years to work with you instead of weeks," he said. "I might be able to learn community development properly, understand philanthropy deeply, become genuinely useful instead of just providing funding." The possibility was exciting, but also complicated. Our friendship had developed within the intensity of terminal diagnosis, the shared understanding that every conversation mattered because time was limited. Would we maintain the same depth of connection if death wasn't immediate? "Richard," I said carefully, "our friendship doesn't depend on your diagnosis. It depends on who you've chosen to become. If you want to spend whatever time you have building community and deepening relationships, we can do that whether it's months or years. But what if having more time makes me lazy about authenticity? He asked. What if I start taking our friendship for granted or get distracted by financial opportunities? Or revert to thinking that accumulating wealth is more important than supporting community? The questions were honest and self-aware, reflecting deep understanding of the patterns that had defined his life before our friendship began. Then I'll remind you who you've chosen to be, I said simply. That's what friends do. They help each other stay true to their best selves. Richard smiled then, the first completely relaxed expression I'd seen from him since receiving the medical news. 21 days, he said, or 21 years. Either way, I want to spend them building something beautiful with someone who helps me remember what matters. Then that's what we'll do, I replied, and meant it completely. That afternoon, we made our scheduled visit to James's carpentry workshop to deliver the foundation's first major grant. The program buzzed with activity as participants worked on custom furniture orders, dining tables for Manhattan restaurants, bookcases for a Brooklyn law firm, kitchen cabinets for a family in Queens who had saved for 2 years to afford handcrafted work. The grant will allow us to hire 2 additional instructors, James explained, as he showed us expanded workshop space that had been unused due to lack of funding. We'll be able to serve 36 people each year instead of 12, and we can offer advanced training in furniture design and small business management. Richard watched program participants work with the same fascination he'd shown during our first visit, but now his attention carried additional weight. Instead of observing as a dying man trying to understand authentic living, he was studying as someone who might have years to support this community properly. I want to learn woodworking, he said suddenly. James looked surprised. You want to take classes? I want to understand what these men are learning, Richard replied. Not just intellectually, but practically. I want to know what it feels like to create something beautiful with my hands. The request represented another step in Richard's ongoing transformation from someone who accumulated wealth to someone who developed skills, from someone who purchased services to someone who contributed labor. We don't usually have students with your background, James said diplomatically. Good, Richard replied. I don't want to be treated differently because of my wealth. I want to be treated as someone learning a craft alongside people who understand what it means to rebuild their lives through skillful work. James agreed to include Richard in the next beginner's class, which would begin the following week. For 6 months, Richard would spend 2 days each week learning traditional joinery techniques alongside formerly incarcerated individuals who were rebuilding their lives through skilled craftsmanship. 6 months, Richard said as we left the workshop. That was unthinkable 3 weeks ago. The idea that I might have 6 months to learn something completely new, develop relationships with people I would never have met otherwise, contribute labor instead of just providing funding. How does it feel? I asked. Like the difference between watching life and participating in life, he said simply. That evening, we celebrated our first successful grant distribution at Maya's Cafe, where word had spread through the neighborhood about the foundation's community focus. Several neighbors stopped by our table to express appreciation for funding that would strengthen local programs, and Maya herself brought a small flan decorated with a candle, her way of acknowledging that something important was beginning. To friendship that grows from conflict, Richard said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. To communities that teach us what authentic living looks like, I replied, touching my cup to his. And to time, he added quietly, however much we have, whatever we do with it. As we prepared to leave, Richard pulled out an envelope that contained a document I hadn't expected to see. My revised will, he said, placing it on the table between us. I've left modest bequests to my sister and her children. Medical expenses are covered, but everything else goes to the foundation. Whether I live 6 more months or 6 more years, this work will continue after I'm gone. The document represented complete commitment to the transformation he'd undergone over the past month. Instead of leaving his wealth to family members who would spend it on luxury or philanthropic organizations that would attach his name to buildings and programs, he was ensuring that his fortune would continue building the kind of communities that had taught him what it meant to be human. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. "Your sister might expect—" "My sister will inherit enough to be comfortable, but not enough to be corrupted by wealth," he interrupted gently. "And she'll inherit the knowledge that her brother spent his final years building something meaningful instead of just accumulating assets." As we walked back through my neighborhood in the cool evening air, Richard seemed more at peace than I'd ever seen him. The medical news had been startling, but it had also clarified his commitment to the life he'd discovered through confronting death. "Thank you," he said as we stopped outside my apartment building, "for helping me understand that authenticity isn't a luxury available only to people facing death. It's a choice available to anyone willing to prioritize relationships over transactions." "Thank you," I replied, "for showing me that wealth can be a tool for building community instead of displaying status, for trusting me with this foundation, for becoming the kind of friend who makes life richer just by being in it." That night, I lay awake thinking about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. 4 weeks earlier, I'd been a waitress serving an arrogant millionaire who used his wealth to humiliate people he considered inferior. Now, I was executive director of a foundation dedicated to supporting communities throughout New York City, working alongside someone who had become one of my dearest friends. Richard's medical news meant our friendship might continue for years instead of weeks, but it also meant he would face the ongoing challenge of choosing authenticity over accumulation, community over isolation, service over performance. The pressure of terminal diagnosis had catalyzed his transformation, but sustaining that transformation would require daily choices about how to use his wealth, time, and influence. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Thank you for agreeing to carry this work forward, whether I have 6 months or 6 years. Having time matters less than using it well." I typed back, "Thank you for showing me that serving others can be about building community instead of just providing labor. However much time any of us have, let's spend it building something beautiful." 6 months or 6 years, he replied. "Building something beautiful," I confirmed. As I finally fell asleep, I realized that Richard's story had become my story too. A narrative about discovering authentic purpose through service to something larger than ourselves, about finding friendship in unexpected places, about learning that wealth and poverty are both just circumstances that can either isolate us from community or connect us more deeply to it. The foundation work would continue, communities would thrive, and 2 people who had met across a restaurant table in conflict had discovered that the most meaningful relationships often begin where we least expect to find them. 6 months later, I stood in James's workshop watching Richard finish his first piece of furniture, a simple wooden bench that he'd planned to donate to Maya's cafe. His technique was still amateur, his joints imperfect, but the concentration and pride in his work reminded me of everything he'd learned about the difference between accumulating wealth and creating value. "It's not much," he said, running his hand over the smooth surface he'd spent weeks perfecting. "It's everything," I replied, and meant it. The Authenticity Foundation had funded 47 community programs throughout the 5 boroughs, creating a network of organizations committed to building dignity and opportunity in neighborhoods that had been overlooked by traditional philanthropy. Elena's community center was serving twice as many elderly immigrants. Maria's literacy program had helped over 100 adults learn to read. Carmen's business incubator had supported 35 new enterprises, and Maya's cafe was offering cooking classes that brought teenagers and elderly neighbors together around traditional recipes and contemporary nutrition. Richard remained in remission, his cancer controlled but not cured, his life measured in meaningful relationships rather than accumulated assets. He spent 2 days each week in the woodworking shop, 2 days visiting foundation grant recipients, and the remaining time working with me to identify new community programs that aligned with our values. "Have you ever wondered what would have happened if I hadn't been dying when we met?" he asked as we shared lunch at Maya's cafe, our friendship having deepened through months of shared work and mutual discovery. "Every day," I admitted, "but I think the cancer just accelerated a transformation that was already waiting to happen. You wouldn't have stayed cruel indefinitely. It was too much work to maintain that kind of isolation. And if you hadn't been working as a waitress, if we'd met in some other context, then maybe we never would have understood the difference between authentic service and performed service," I said. "Maybe we never would have learned that the goal isn't to eliminate inequality, but to ensure that everyone has access to dignity and community regardless of their economic circumstances." Maya brought our check along with a small plate of cookies she'd baked, using a recipe her grandmother had brought from Guatemala. Another example of the intergenerational wisdom sharing that the foundation supported throughout the city. "To friendship that transforms both people involved," Richard said, raising his coffee cup in our familiar toast. "To communities that teach us what it means to be human," I replied. "And to time well spent, however much we have," we said together. As we prepared to leave for our afternoon visit to a new community garden in the Bronx, Richard checked his phone and smiled at a text from his sister, announcing that his nephew had been accepted to college with a partial scholarship that would allow him to pursue environmental science without crushing debt. "My nephew wants to study sustainable agriculture," Richard said. "He wants to help communities grow their own food instead of depending on industrial systems that extract wealth from neighborhoods instead of nourishing them." "He learned that from his uncle," I observed. "He learned that from communities like these," Richard corrected, gesturing around Maya's cafe where neighbors gathered daily to share meals and conversations that strengthened their collective life. "I just had enough money to support what they were already building." The afternoon was spent in a community garden that had transformed a vacant lot into 3 acres of vegetable plots, fruit trees, and gathering spaces where families from 12 different countries shared gardening techniques and celebrated harvests that fed both bodies and community connections. "Next month, we're hosting our first annual community festival," explained Rosa, the garden's coordinator. "Families will bring dishes made with vegetables they've grown here, and we'll have music and dancing and children's activities. The whole neighborhood is invited." Richard volunteered to help with setup and logistics, and I watched him discuss sound system rental and permit applications with the same attention he'd once devoted to stock portfolios and cryptocurrency investments. He was learning to use his resources and connections to support community celebrations rather than accumulate individual wealth. "1 year ago, I would have donated money for this festival and felt satisfied with my philanthropy," he told me as we walked home through the Queens neighborhood that had become familiar territory for both of us. "Now I understand that the money is just the beginning. The real satisfaction comes from participating in what the money enables." "And if the cancer comes back?" I asked gently. We'd learned to discuss his mortality openly rather than avoiding the topic that had brought us together. "Then I'll continue this work for whatever time I have," he said simply, "and you'll continue it after I'm gone, and the communities will continue it after all of us are gone, because building authentic relationships and supporting human dignity isn't dependent on any individual person living forever." That evening, as we reviewed grant applications in my apartment that had become our unofficial foundation headquarters, I reflected on the transformation of both our lives over the past year. Richard had evolved from someone isolated by wealth to someone connected through service. I had grown from someone limited by economic circumstances to someone empowered by purpose that transcended financial constraints. "Do you know what I've learned?" Richard said as we finished reviewing proposals for next quarter's funding cycle. "What?" "That the opposite of loneliness isn't wealth or romance or fame," he said. It's being useful to people you care about while doing work that matters. And the opposite of poverty isn't wealth, I added. It's having enough resources to contribute to your community instead of just surviving within it. We sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by applications from communities throughout the city who understood that dignity and opportunity were more important than charity, that relationships were more valuable than transactions, that authentic living required connection to something larger than individual acquisition. "Thank you," Richard said quietly, "for teaching me the difference between serving wealth and serving community, for showing me what authentic friendship looks like, for agreeing to carry this work forward." "Thank you," I replied, "for showing me that transformation is possible at any stage of life, for trusting me with this foundation, for becoming the kind of person who makes everyone around him more hopeful about what humans can become." As Richard prepared to return to his apartment in Manhattan, a space he'd gradually transformed from a showcase of wealth to a home that reflected his actual interests and relationships, he handed me a small photograph. "My parents," he said. "I've been carrying this since our visit to their graves. I wanted you to have it." The photo showed a couple in their 40s, smiling in front of a modest house with a small garden. They looked happy in the way people do when their lives align with their values, when they understand their place in their community, when they measure success by the quality of their relationships rather than the quantity of their possessions. "They would have loved you," Richard said. "They would have appreciated what you've helped me become." "They would have been proud of you," I replied, "for using your time well regardless of how much you have." As he headed toward the subway that would carry him back to Manhattan, Richard turned once more. "Tomorrow," he called out, "we start reviewing applications for the summer funding cycle. There's a community theater program in Brooklyn that needs support, and a shared economy initiative in the Bronx that I think you'll find fascinating." "Tomorrow," I called back, "building something beautiful." That night, I placed the photograph of Richard's parents on my kitchen table next to the foundation documents and grant applications that had taken over my small apartment. Their faces reminded me that authenticity wasn't complicated. It just required choosing relationships over transactions, community over isolation, service over performance. My phone buzzed with Richard's goodnight text. 6 months cancer-free, hundreds of community programs supported, one friendship that changed everything. Not bad for someone who thought he had 30 days to live. I typed back, not bad for someone who thought she was just serving expensive dinners to people who would never see her humanity. "See you tomorrow, friend," he replied. "See you tomorrow," I confirmed. As I finally fell asleep, I thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by our unlikely friendship. Elena and her elderly immigrants, Maria and her adult literacy students, James and his formerly incarcerated carpenters, Carmen and her immigrant entrepreneurs, Maya and her neighborhood cooking classes. Communities throughout the city were thriving because a dying millionaire and an invisible waitress had discovered that authentic service creates relationships that transform everyone involved. Richard might have 6 more months or 6 more years, but the foundation would continue long after both of us were gone, supporting communities that understood the difference between wealth and worth, between accumulation and contribution, between existing and living with purpose. Have you ever found yourself serving people who didn't see your full humanity? Have you ever wondered what your life might become if you chose community over isolation, relationships over transactions? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps this message reach another person who serves with dignity and dreams of being truly seen. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving. You can find it here by clicking on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. I'll see you in the next story.